Hello there, and welcome. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Adjust your pillow, let your body settle into whatever position feels right. There's no rush. We have all the time in the world. Where in the world are you watching from? A quiet bedroom as the night deepens? A cozy corner where the weight of the day is finally lifting? Wherever you are, you're exactly where you need to be. Tonight we're going to explore the life of JP. Morgan, the banker who became more powerful than presidents, the man whose office at 23 Wall Street could save or shake the American economy with a single decision. We'll walk slowly through his world of mahogany desks and Renaissance paintings, through financial panics and billion-dollar deals, through an era when one man's handshake carried more weight than all the contracts in Manhattan. We'll discover how he saved the country in 1907, how he built an empire not just of money but of beauty, and what his story tells us about power, trust, and the strange alchemy of banking in an age before computers, before regulations, before anyone quite knew the rules. But don't worry. This isn't going to be a frantic recounting of financial drama or a sensational exploration of robber baron excess. Instead, we'll move slowly and carefully through Morgan's life, from his childhood in Connecticut to his final days in Rome, through the deals and the crises and the quiet moments in his library surrounded by medieval manuscripts. We'll take our time with the numbers, the personalities, the complicated legacy he left behind. By the end, I think you'll find that JP Morgan was not just a banker, but a figure who embodied an entire era, and whose passing marked the end of a very particular kind of power. If you enjoy these calm explorations of history's most fascinating financial figures, a like and subscribe really helps reach others seeking the same peaceful way to end their day. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being part of this community of thoughtful listeners, so settle in. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears, take a slow breath, in through your nose, out through your mouth, and let's begin our slow drift through the Gilded Age, through the world of 19th century banking, through the making of the most powerful banker America has ever known. There's nowhere you need to be, no deadlines to meet. Just listen and let the story unfold like a long, quiet conversation between old friends. Let it wash over you. If you drift away, that's perfectly fine. That's what we're here for. Let's begin in 1837 in Hartford, Connecticut, where a baby was born who would change American finance forever. The baby's name was John Pierpont Morgan, though everyone would eventually call him Pierpont, or simply JP. He arrived on April 17th, 1837, in a substantial brick house in Hartford, into a family that already understood money and how it moved through the world. This wasn't a rags to riches story, not one of those American tales of rising from nothing. The Morgans were already comfortable, already connected, already part of the world of banking and commerce that was beginning to define the young American Republic. His father, Junius Spencer Morgan, was a merchant and banker, a man of ambition and considerable talent. Junius had married Juliet Pierpont, daughter of a prominent Hartford family, poets and ministers and people of culture. The baby inherited his middle name from his mother's side, that distinguished Pierpont lineage. From the beginning he was born into expectations, into a world where business acumen and social standing intertwined, where the right name opened doors and the right connections made fortunes. Hartford in 1837 was a prosperous New England city, built on insurance and manufacturing, on the steady accumulation of capital through prudent investment and careful management. It wasn't New York, not yet the centre of American finance, but it was respectable, solid, the kind of place where fortunes were made slowly, through hard work and conservative business practices. The Morgans fit perfectly into this world, neither the wealthiest family in Hartford nor the poorest, but firmly established in the upper reaches of society. Young Pierpont's childhood was comfortable but not ostentatious. The Morgan household valued education, culture, refinement. They attended the Asylum Hill Congregational Church. They believed in hard work, in moral rectitude, in the Protestant virtues that Max Weber would later identify as the spirit of capitalism. But they also believed in beauty, in art, in the finer things that money could buy. This combination, practical business sense married to aesthetic appreciation, would define Pierpont Morgan throughout his life. But Pierpont was not a robust child. From an early age, he suffered from health problems that would plague him throughout his life. He developed a skin condition, a kind of dermatitis that caused his face to break out in painful rashes and lesions. This condition would worsen over the years, eventually disfiguring his nose, causing it to swell and redden and take on a bulbous appearance that made him self-conscious, and, some said, contributed to his gruff, intimidating manner. People stared at his nose. He learned to stare back, harder, more intimidating, until they looked away. He also suffered from severe headaches, from what might have been rheumatic fever, from various ailments that kept him home from school, that made his childhood more solitary than it might otherwise have been. These illnesses shaped him. He learned to endure pain without complaint. He developed an inner strength, a determination not to be limited by his body's weakness. And perhaps the illnesses made him more thoughtful, more introspective, forced him to spend time alone when other boys were playing, reading books when he might have preferred to be outside. When Pierpont was 15 years old, in 1852, his father made a decision that would change the trajectory of both their lives. Junius had been invited to become a partner in a London banking house, a significant opportunity to connect American commerce with European capital. London was the financial centre of the world in the mid-19th century, the place where money flowed and deals were made and fortunes were built. For an ambitious American banker, a partnership in a London house was the pinnacle of achievement. Junius accepted. The family would move to London. But first, Pierpont needed an education befitting a young man destined for international banking. Junius decided to send his son to school in Europe, to give him the kind of cosmopolitan education that few Americans received, to make him comfortable in the European world where so much of banking was conducted. And so, in 1854, Pierpont Morgan found himself in Switzerland, enrolled in a school near Lake Geneva, learning French and German, studying mathematics and science and languages, breathing the clear mountain air and growing stronger, more confident, more worldly. This experience was transformative. Most American boys never left their home states, never mind crossing the Atlantic. Pierpont was 17 years old, living among Europeans, learning their languages and customs and ways of thinking, becoming fluent in the international culture of banking and commerce. He spent time in Germany as well, studying at the University of Göttingen, one of Europe's great centres of learning. He studied mathematics with a rigour that would serve him well in banking. He travelled through Europe, visiting museums and cathedrals, beginning to develop the love of art and beauty that would become his passion. He was absorbing not just education but cultivation, taste, the ability to move comfortably in the higher circles of European society. When he returned to America in 1857, at age 20, Pierpont Morgan was no longer just a Hartford boy. He was a young man who spoke fluent French and German, who had studied at European universities, who carried himself with a confidence and worldliness unusual in someone so young. He was tall, over 6 feet, which was very tall for that era, with broad shoulders and a commanding physical presence. Despite his unfortunate skin condition, despite the nose that was already beginning to show signs of the disease that would disfigure it, there was something imposing about him, something that made people take notice. He arrived in New York City in the fall of 1857, just as the country was sliding into a financial panic. Banks were failing. The stock market was crashing. Credit had dried up. It was a terrible time to begin a banking career, or perhaps, in a strange way, the perfect time, because it taught young Pierpont Morgan from the very start that finance was not a calm, orderly business, but a world of risk and crisis and sudden reversals of fortune. His father had arranged a position for him at the banking house of Duncan, Sherman and Company, a firm with strong ties to Junius Morgan's London house. Pierpont started at the bottom, or at least the bottom for a young man of his background and education. He worked as a clerk, learning the practical details of banking, how to assess credit, how to evaluate securities, how to manage the flow of money between New York and London, between merchants and investors, between those who needed capital and those who had it to lend. The work was meticulous and, frankly, boring. Clerks copied letters by hand, maintained ledgers, calculated interest and exchange rates, filed documents. There were no typewriters, no adding machines, no telephones. Everything was done by hand, slowly, carefully, with attention to every detail, because a single mistake could cost thousands of dollars or destroy a crucial relationship. Banking in the mid-19th century was a business of letters and ledgers, of relationships built through correspondence and occasional face-to-face meetings, of trust built over years and destroyed in moments. But Pierpont Morgan was learning. He absorbed how the banking world worked, how merchants needed letters of credit to buy goods from abroad, how shipping companies needed capital to build vessels, how railroads, just beginning to spread across the American continent, needed enormous amounts of money that no single investor could provide. He learned how banking houses brought together multiple investors to fund large projects, how they assessed risk and charged fees and made profits not from manufacturing anything or growing anything, but simply from moving money, from connecting capital to enterprise. He learned too about the personalities of banking. This was a business built on reputation, on personal trust, on knowing whom you could rely upon and whom you couldn't. A man's word mattered more than contracts, because contracts could be broken and lawsuits took years. But a man who broke his word was finished in banking, would never be trusted again, would find himself shut out of every opportunity. Young Morgan was learning to read people, to assess character, to trust his instincts about human nature, and he was beginning to be noticed. Despite his youth, despite his relative inexperience, there was something about Pierpont Morgan that commanded respect. Perhaps it was his physical presence, his imposing height and broad frame. Perhaps it was his European education, his ability to speak fluent French with European clients, his comfort with the international aspects of banking. Perhaps it was simply that he was Junius Morgan's son, and everyone knew that Junius Morgan was becoming one of the most important American bankers in London. But whatever the reason, people began to pay attention to young Pierpont. The world he had entered, this world of New York banking in 1857, was both exciting and precarious. New York was growing rapidly, transforming from a prosperous port city into something approaching a metropolis. Broadway was lined with shops and theatres. The city was pushing northward, beyond 14th Street toward the open fields that would eventually become Central Park. Immigrants poured in from Ireland and Germany, providing labour for the factories and workshops that were beginning to define American industry. Wealth was accumulating. Fortunes were being made in shipping and railroads and manufacturing. And all of it required capital, required banking, required the services of houses like Duncan, Sherman and Company. But it was also a world of extraordinary instability. The panic of 1857 that greeted Morgan's arrival was just one in a series of regular financial crises that punctuated 19th century American life. The economy expanded and contracted in wild cycles. Banks failed regularly. Companies went bankrupt. Fortunes vanished overnight. There was no federal regulation of banking, no central bank to step in during crises, no deposit insurance to protect savers. If your bank failed, your money was gone. If your investments turned bad, you lost everything. It was capitalism red in tooth and claw, and it produced both tremendous innovation and tremendous suffering. Young Pierpont Morgan watched this world, learned from it, began to understand it. He saw how panic spread, how fear could destroy even sound institutions, how the lack of reliable information created uncertainty that fed on itself. He saw how crucial it was to maintain confidence, to project strength even in difficult times, to be the person others turned to when everything seemed to be falling apart. These lessons, learned in his early 20s, would shape his entire approach to banking. He lived modestly in these early years, sharing rooms with other young clerks, attending church on Sundays, working long hours at Duncan Sherman. He sent letters to his father in London, describing the American banking scene, asking for advice, slowly building a relationship that was both filial and professional. Junius was demanding, exacting, quick to criticize errors, but also genuinely interested in his son's development, patient in explaining the intricacies of international finance. And Pierpont was growing, not just in knowledge but in confidence and ambition. He understood that he was apprenticing for something larger, that his father intended him to eventually take over the American side of the Morgan banking operations, that he was being groomed to become someone important in the financial world. This created pressure, certainly, but also opportunity. He had a path before him, a future that was clear and promising, if only he could prove himself worthy. The New York he lived in, the banking world he worked in, was about to be convulsed by something far more serious than a financial panic. The 1850s was sliding toward the 1860s, and the tensions over slavery that had simmered for decades were approaching boiling point. The South and North were moving toward irreconcilable positions. War was coming, though few people wanted to believe it. And when war came, it would transform America, its economy, its government, its financial system, its entire relationship between North and South, between agriculture and industry, between past and future. Pierpont Morgan, 20 years old in 1857, couldn't know any of this, couldn't know that the war would create opportunities for some and destroy the prospects of others, couldn't know that his own actions during the war years would be controversial and complicated, couldn't know that he was standing at the beginning of an extraordinary journey that would take him to the very pinnacle of American financial power. He was just a young clerk in a banking house, learning his trade, trying to make his father proud, nursing his various ailments, carrying himself with a dignity and seriousness beyond his years. But the foundation was being laid, the education was being absorbed, the character was being formed. The man who would one day be able to save the United States Treasury with a single bond sale, who would create the world's first billion-dollar corporation, who would personally prevent a complete financial collapse in 1907, who would be called to testify before Congress about his power and influence. That man was beginning to emerge from the chrysalis of youth and inexperience, slowly, patiently, learning his craft in the streets and counting houses of New York City. Let that image settle in your mind for a moment. A tall young man, self-conscious about his appearance but projecting confidence nonetheless, walking down Wall Street in the late 1850s, past the Custom House and Trinity Church, toward the offices where he spent his days copying letters and calculating exchange rates, learning the business that would define his life. The city around him growing, changing, rushing toward a future no one could quite predict. And this young man, Pierpont Morgan, absorbing it all, patient, ambitious, preparing himself for opportunities he couldn't yet imagine. The 1860s arrived, and with them came the war that everyone had feared and no one had quite believed would really happen. In April of 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, and the United States fractured into civil war. The conflict would last 4 years, kill more than 600,000 men, and transform America from a loose confederation of states into a true nation. It would also transform American finance, creating opportunities for those positioned to take advantage of them, and raising moral questions that would echo for generations. Pierpont Morgan was 24 years old when the war began, of prime military age, and yet he did not serve. This was not unusual among young men of his social class. The draft laws, when they were eventually enacted, allowed men to hire substitutes or pay commutation fees to avoid service. Morgan paid for a substitute, as did many others with the means to do so. This was legal, accepted, and yet it created a division between those who fought and those who profited from the war, a division that would mark American society for decades. During the war years, Morgan was involved in a transaction that would follow him throughout his life, the Hall Carbine affair. The details are complex and the morality ambiguous, as is often the case with wartime business dealings. Briefly, it involved the purchase of defective carbines from a government arsenal and their resale to another part of the government at a substantial profit. Morgan was not the principal in this transaction, but he helped finance it through his banking house. The carbines were indeed defective, potentially dangerous to the soldiers who would use them, and yet the sale was technically legal, the contracts were fulfilled, and profits were made. Was this profiteering from the suffering of soldiers? Was it simply business? Taking advantage of government disorganization and desperate need for weapons? The question has no simple answer. Morgan himself seemed to feel no particular guilt about the transaction. He had provided capital, charged interest, made a profit. That was banking. Others saw it differently, saw it as emblematic of northern businessmen enriching themselves while other men died in trenches. Both perspectives contain truth. Let that complexity rest without judgment. Because the purpose here is not to prosecute or defend, but simply to understand the world Morgan inhabited, where business and patriotism and self-interest intertwined in ways that defy easy moral categorization. The war years were profitable for Morgan, and for the banking house he worked for. Wars require enormous amounts of capital. Governments need to borrow, merchants need to finance shipments, manufacturers need funds to expand production. Banking thrives in such times, and Morgan thrived with it. He was learning rapidly how large sums of money could be raised, how government bonds could be sold, how the flow of capital could be managed and directed. But the war years also brought personal tragedy that would mark Morgan more deeply than any business transaction. In October of 1861, when the war was just beginning, Morgan married Amelia Sturgis, called Mimi, the daughter of a prosperous New York merchant. She was beautiful, educated, cultured, everything a young banker could want in a wife. The wedding was held at her family's home. Morgan, 24 years old, seemed to have found the personal happiness that would complement his growing professional success. But Mimi was ill. She had tuberculosis, called consumption in that era, a wasting disease that destroyed the lungs and for which there was no cure. Perhaps Morgan didn't know the extent of her illness when they married. Perhaps he knew and married her anyway, hoping that love and care could somehow overcome disease. They honeymooned in Europe, seeking warmer climates and better air, the standard treatment for tuberculosis. They travelled to Algiers, to the Mediterranean coast, to places where the sun shone warm and the air was dry and clean. It didn't help. Mimi's condition worsened. By February of 1862, just 4 months after the wedding, she was dying. Morgan brought her back to New York to her family's home, and there, in February, she died. She was 21 years old. They had been married for 4 months. The grief was profound and for Morgan deeply private. He was not a man who expressed emotion easily, who shared his inner life with others, but those who knew him saw how the loss affected him. He withdrew into himself, threw himself into work with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He attended her grave regularly, placing flowers, sitting in silence. The experience taught him something about the fragility of life, about how quickly joy could turn to sorrow, about how little control even a powerful man had over the things that truly mattered. For several years, Morgan remained unmarried, focused entirely on his career. His father, watching from London, worried about him, encouraged him to engage with life again, to not let grief consume him. And slowly, gradually, Morgan did emerge from his mourning. In 1865, he met Frances Louisa Tracy, called Fanny, the daughter of a prominent New York lawyer. She was different from Mimi. less fragile, more practical, capable of managing a household and social obligations with efficiency and grace. They married in May of 1865, just a month after the Civil War ended with Lee's surrender at Appomattox. This marriage would last. Fanny proved to be an excellent partner for an ambitious banker. She managed their household, raised their children, entertained clients and business associates, and asked few questions about the business that consumed so much of her husband's time and energy. They would have 4 children together: Louisa, John Pierpont Jr., Juliet, and Anne. The Morgan household became established, respectable, part of New York's upper social circles. Fanny provided stability, domestic order, a foundation upon which Morgan could build his professional empire. The years after the Civil War saw America transformed. The war had settled the question of union. The country would remain one nation, indivisible. It had also accelerated industrialization. Railroads, which had been expanding before the war, now exploded across the continent. Steel production increased dramatically. Factories multiplied, cities grew, capital accumulated. And all of this required banking, required the services of men like Pierpont Morgan, who could connect European capital with American enterprise, who could raise the enormous sums needed to build railroads and factories and the infrastructure of a modern industrial nation. In 1864, Morgan had left Duncan, Sherman and Company to form his own firm, initially in partnership with his cousin. But this arrangement didn't last. What Morgan needed was a true partner, someone with capital and connections and complementary skills. In 1871, he found that partner in Anthony Drexel of Philadelphia. Drexel was older, wealthier, more established. His banking house, Drexel and Company, was one of the most respected in America. The partnership they formed, Drexel, Morgan and Company, combined Drexel's capital and reputation with Morgan's energy and European connections through his father's London house. The firm's offices were at the corner of Wall Street and Broad, in the heart of New York's financial district. Morgan worked from a large desk in an open room where he could see all his employees, where clients could approach him directly, where the business of banking unfolded in full view. This was before private offices became standard, before the mahogany-panelled suites that would later characterize investment banking. The office was functional, busy, filled with clerks copying correspondence and maintaining ledgers, with clients coming and going, with messengers arriving with telegrams bearing news from London or Philadelphia or Chicago. Morgan's particular genius, which became apparent in these years, was in reorganization. The American economy was growing explosively, but it was also chaotic, inefficient, prone to wild speculation and periodic collapse. This was especially true of the railroads. By the 1870s, America had built more railroad track than the rest of the world combined, over 50,000 miles of steel rails connecting cities and towns and farms, carrying freight and passengers, binding the nation together. But the railroad industry was a mess. Railroads had been built hastily, often with little planning or coordination. Multiple competing lines served the same routes, driving down prices and profits. Other routes were underserved. Financial structures were complex and unstable. Railroad companies were capitalized with confusing mixtures of stocks and bonds, often overcapitalized, sometimes built more to enrich their promoters than to provide actual transportation. Many railroads went bankrupt regularly, unable to service their debts, leaving investors ruined and service disrupted. Morgan saw opportunity in this chaos. When a railroad went bankrupt, its bondholders, the people who had lent money to the company, faced losses. But if the railroad could be reorganized, made efficient and profitable, then the bonds might retain value. Morgan began specializing in railroad reorganizations. When a railroad failed, he would step in, working with the bondholders to restructure the debt, working with management to improve operations, sometimes replacing incompetent managers with better ones, consolidating competing lines, creating efficient systems out of chaos. This process came to be called Morganization. It involved detailed analysis of a railroad's operations, its routes, its costs, its competitive position. It involved tough negotiations with creditors and shareholders. It involved, often, taking control of the railroad through voting trusts, legal arrangements where Morgan would hold the voting rights of enough stock to control the company's board of directors, ensuring that his reorganization plans were implemented and that management served the interests of the bondholders rather than engaging in further speculation or mismanagement. The work was meticulous and required patience. Railroad reorganizations could take months or years. They required traveling to inspect physical assets, examining track condition, visiting rail yards, assessing the quality of rolling stock. They required understanding the geography of American commerce, knowing which routes were valuable and which were marginal. They required negotiating skills, the ability to convince multiple parties with conflicting interests to accept a common plan. And they required authority, the ability to command respect and enforce decisions. Morgan excelled at this work. His physical presence helped. He was imposing, spoke in a deep voice, met people's eyes with an unflinching gaze that many found intimidating. His reputation for honesty helped too. In an era of rampant speculation and fraud, Morgan was known as a man who kept his word, who dealt fairly even when he didn't have to, who thought long-term rather than seeking short-term gains. If Morgan reorganized your railroad, you could trust that the new structure would be sound, that the financial arrangements would be sustainable, that the company had a genuine chance of success. The financial concepts behind Morganization were relatively simple, though the execution was complex. When a railroad went bankrupt, it couldn't pay its debts. The bondholders, those who had lent money to the company, had a choice. They could force liquidation, selling off the railroad's assets to recover whatever they could, which usually meant getting only a fraction of their money back. Or they could agree to a reorganization, accepting new securities, new bonds and stock, in exchange for their old worthless bonds, giving the company a fresh start with more manageable debt. Morgan's role was to design this reorganization and convince all parties to accept it. He would create a new capital structure with less debt, issue new securities, sometimes require stockholders to contribute additional capital to make the plan work. He would install new management, create voting trusts to maintain control during the reorganization period, establish operating procedures to prevent the abuses that had led to failure in the first place, and for this work, he charged fees for designing the reorganization, fees for selling the new securities, ongoing fees for serving on boards of directors and monitoring the reorganized companies. These fees accumulated. Over the 1870s and 80s, Morgan reorganized numerous railroads, the Philadelphia and Reading, the Chesapeake and Ohio, the Northern Pacific and others. Each reorganization added to his wealth and, more importantly, to his influence. The railroad industry was the largest sector of the American economy, employing hundreds of thousands of workers, moving the freight that allowed commerce to function, connecting the nation's regions into a single market. And increasingly, this crucial industry was being shaped by Pierpont Morgan's decisions about which railroads would survive, which would be consolidated, which would receive capital, and which would be allowed to fail. But Morgan was building more than a business empire. He was also building a personal world of increasing refinement and beauty. As his wealth grew, he began to indulge his passion for art and beautiful objects. He started collecting seriously in the 1870s, paintings, sculpture, decorative arts, rare books and manuscripts. He frequented the galleries and auction houses of New York and Europe, developing relationships with dealers who would bring him exceptional pieces. He bought Renaissance paintings, medieval manuscripts illuminated by monks, ancient Egyptian artifacts, Chinese porcelain, Limoges enamels. His taste was eclectic, but always focused on objects of the highest quality and historical significance. In 1882, Morgan commissioned the building of a new home at 219 Madison Avenue, at 36th Street, then an elegant residential neighbourhood well north of the commercial districts. The house was substantial, but not ostentatious by the standards of Gilded Age New York. Brownstone exterior, 4 stories, dignified and solid. The interior was another matter. Morgan filled it with his growing art collection, with beautiful furniture and tapestries, with objects that turned the house into something approaching a private museum. Walking through the rooms was like touring centuries of human artistic achievement. A Raphael painting here, a Gutenberg Bible there, Tang Dynasty ceramics, Renaissance bronzes, medieval reliquaries containing the supposed bones of saints. He also acquired a yacht, because every wealthy man of the Gilded Age needed a yacht, and Morgan was becoming very wealthy indeed. His first significant yacht, acquired in 1882, was named Corsair, a name that would be passed down through 3 successive vessels, each larger and more luxurious than the last. The Corsair was more than recreational. Morgan conducted business aboard the yacht, inviting clients and partners for cruises along the coast, negotiating deals while sailing through Long Island Sound or up the Hudson River. There was something about being aboard the yacht, away from offices and formal settings, that made people more relaxed, more willing to agree to terms, more susceptible to Morgan's considerable powers of persuasion. His daily routine became established in these years. He would arrive at the office at 10 o'clock each morning, not early by the standards of clerks and junior employees, but then Morgan was not a clerk. He would spend the day in meetings, reading correspondence, making decisions. He rarely worked with papers spread across his desk. In fact, his desk was usually empty, completely clear except for whatever single matter he was considering at that moment. This was deliberate. Morgan believed in focusing completely on one thing at a time, giving it his full attention, making a decision, and then moving to the next matter. The empty desk became a kind of symbol of his approach to business, clear, decisive, uncluttered by unnecessary details. He smoked cigars constantly, large, expensive cigars that filled the office with aromatic smoke. He played solitaire when thinking through difficult problems, the card somehow helping him order his thoughts. He had a temper, famous and frightening, that could erupt when he felt someone was wasting his time or acting dishonestly. But he also had a sentimental side, particularly about his family, about art, about beauty. He could be unexpectedly generous, quietly helping people in difficulty, supporting churches and charities, doing good works that he never publicized. Through all these years, Morgan maintained close contact with his father in London. Junius Morgan had become one of the most important American bankers in Europe, the man European investors turned to when they wanted to invest in American securities. The relationship between father and son was complex, respectful, affectionate, but also marked by Junius's high expectations and quick criticism when Pierpont fell short. They corresponded regularly, multiple times per week, discussing market conditions, specific transactions, strategy. Junius's London house and Pierpont's New York house worked together, coordinating their activities, presenting a unified front to clients and competitors. But there was tension too. Pierpont was building his own reputation, making his own decisions, and he chafed sometimes under his father's continuing oversight. He was in his 40s and 50s, but still reporting to his father like a junior partner. Junius, for his part, worried that Pierpont was too impulsive, too willing to trust his instincts rather than carefully analysing situations, too focused on building personal power rather than serving clients' interests. These tensions never broke into open conflict. The Morgan family was far too proper for that, but they simmered beneath the surface of their correspondence and occasional meetings. In April of 1890, Junius Morgan died in a carriage accident while vacationing in France. He was 76 years old, still active in banking, still the senior partner in the Morgan financial empire. His death was sudden and unexpected, a shock to everyone who knew him. Pierpont, 53 years old, received the news by telegraph and immediately sailed for Europe. He arrived too late for the funeral, but in time to settle his father's affairs and, more importantly, to assume full control of the family's banking operations. Junius left an estate worth approximately $10 million, an enormous fortune for that era. But more important than the money was what Pierpont inherited in terms of relationships, reputation, and position. He was now the Morgan, the head of the family, the senior partner in J.P. Morgan and Company. The firm had been renamed after Drexel's retirement. He was no longer working in his father's shadow, no longer the younger Morgan who had to prove himself. He was the Morgan, and the name now belonged to him alone. The years from 1857 to 1890 had seen Pierpont Morgan transform from a young clerk, learning the basics of banking, to one of the most powerful financiers in America. He had built a successful firm, pioneered new approaches to corporate finance, accumulated substantial wealth, and created a life of culture and refinement surrounded by beautiful objects. He had suffered personal tragedy with the death of his first wife, found stability in his second marriage, raised a family, and established himself in New York society. He had learned his craft through decades of patient work, through reorganizing railroads and negotiating with difficult personalities, and studying the flow of capital between Europe and America. But in 1890, at age 53, he was just approaching the peak of his power and influence. The greatest achievements and the greatest controversies still lay ahead. The next decade would see him involved in rescuing the United States Treasury, creating the world's first billion-dollar corporation, and building a level of financial power that would eventually make him, quite literally, more influential in economic matters than the President of the United States. But all of that was still to come. For now, as 1890 ended and the final decade of the 19th century began, Pierpont Morgan stood at a threshold, ready to step into the full exercise of the extraordinary power he had spent 3 decades building. Let that image rest for a moment. Morgan in 1890, 53 years old, his father recently dead, his own power now unchecked and unquestioned within his firm, his reputation established, his fortune made, his art collection growing. His life settled into patterns of work and collecting and family. The Gilded Age was at its height. America was becoming an industrial power that would soon rival Europe. New York was becoming the financial capital, not just of America, but of the world, and Pierpont Morgan, more than any other single individual, embodied this transformation, this concentration of financial power in fewer and fewer hands. This emerging system where capital and industry intertwined in ways that previous generations had never imagined. The stage was set, the key players were in position, and the greatest dramas of Morgan's career were about to unfold. The 1890s began with Morgan firmly established as one of the most important bankers in America, but it was during this decade that he would transform from merely important to truly indispensable, from powerful to something approaching essential. This was the decade when his personal authority became so great that governments and corporations and entire industries deferred to his judgment, when his approval or disapproval could determine the success or failure of ventures involving millions of dollars and thousands of workers. His headquarters was at 23 Wall Street, a building that would come to be known simply as the House of Morgan. It wasn't a particularly impressive structure from the outside, just 4 stories of pale stone, dignified but not ostentatious, squeezed between taller buildings in the narrow canyons of lower Manhattan. But inside, everyone knew the real power resided. This was where Pierpont Morgan made the decisions that shaped American finance. This was where he held court, where supplicants came seeking capital or approval, or simply the blessing of association with his name. Morgan's office was on the main floor, visible from the entrance, a deliberate choice that communicated accessibility and transparency, even while maintaining formidable authority. The room was panelled in dark wood, lit by gas lamps and later by electric lights, furnished with leather chairs and Persian rugs. But the most striking feature was Morgan's desk. It was always empty, completely clear. No papers, no files, no clutter of any kind except perhaps a single document he was considering at that moment. This empty desk became legendary, discussed and debated among those who did business with Morgan. Some saw it as a sign of his extraordinary mental capacity. He could keep everything in his head, needed no reminders or references. Others saw it as theatre, a way of demonstrating control and power, of showing that he was not overwhelmed by details like ordinary men. The truth was probably simpler. Morgan believed in focusing completely on one matter at a time, giving it his full attention, making a decision, and then clearing the desk, literally and metaphorically, for the next matter. The empty desk was a discipline, a method for maintaining clarity of thought in a world that was becoming increasingly complex and fast-paced. His method of making decisions was equally distinctive. He didn't rely primarily on detailed financial analysis or elaborate calculations, though his firm certainly had people who performed such work. Instead, Morgan trusted his judgment of character and his intuition about situations. He would meet with people seeking his investment or support, and he would look at them, really look at them, with those penetrating eyes that so many found intimidating. He was assessing them, reading them, deciding whether they were honest, competent, worthy of trust. This wasn't mysticism or guesswork. It was a skill honed over decades of dealing with people, of learning to distinguish between those who would honour their commitments and those who wouldn't, between sound business propositions and speculative fantasies. He smoked constantly while working, going through cigars at a prodigious rate. The smoke filled his office, creating an atmosphere that some visitors found oppressive but that Morgan apparently needed. The ritual of lighting and smoking somehow part of his thinking process. He also kept a deck of cards on his desk and would play solitaire when puzzling through difficult problems, the mechanical act of laying out cards and playing through hands apparently helping him order his thoughts and arrive at decisions. His routine was predictable. He arrived at the office around 10 o'clock in the morning, having breakfasted at home and read the morning newspapers. He worked through until early afternoon, meeting with partners and clients, reviewing correspondence, making decisions. He took lunch either at his desk or at one of the private clubs where New York's business elite gathered. Afternoons were often spent in meetings or, when the weather was good, aboard his yacht. He rarely stayed at the office past 4 or 5 in the evening, believing that the important decisions had been made by then and that excessive work hours were a sign of inefficiency rather than dedication. But don't mistake this relatively leisurely schedule for laziness or lack of intensity. When Morgan was working, he was completely focused, and his decisions often involved enormous sums and far-reaching consequences. A single morning might involve approving a railroad reorganization affecting thousands of workers, declining to support a steel company seeking expansion capital, and reviewing plans for a new bond issue that would raise millions for a growing industrial concern. The work was mentally exhausting, even if it wasn't physically demanding, requiring constant judgment, constant assessment of risk and opportunity, constant balancing of competing interests. During the 1890s, Morgan's art collection grew from a personal hobby into something approaching a major cultural institution. He bought voraciously, travelling to Europe regularly to visit galleries and auction houses, building relationships with the most important art dealers of his era. He acquired Renaissance paintings by masters like Raphael and Perugino, medieval manuscripts illuminated in gold and brilliant colours, ancient Egyptian artefacts, Chinese porcelain that had survived centuries, sculpture and decorative arts from across the centuries of human civilization. The collection wasn't just about acquisition or display of wealth. Morgan genuinely loved beautiful objects, loved the craftsmanship and artistry they represented, loved the connection they provided to human history and achievement. He could spend hours examining a medieval manuscript, appreciating the patience required to illuminate each letter by hand, the skill of the artist who had created images of saints and angels in an age without photography or mechanical reproduction. He could hold an ancient Egyptian Ushabti figure, a small carved servant meant to serve a pharaoh in the afterlife, and feel connected across 3,000 years to the people who had believed so deeply in an eternal world beyond this one. He stored many of these treasures in his Madison Avenue home, which was becoming increasingly crowded with art and artifacts. Eventually he would build a separate library building next door to house his most precious pieces, but in the 1890s he was still accumulating, still learning, still developing the eye and knowledge that would eventually make him one of the world's great collectors. His annual trips to Europe were partly about business, coordinating with European banks, meeting with potential clients, but increasingly they were about art, about adding to his collection, about surrounding himself with beauty. His yacht, the Corsair, was another passion and another tool. The first Corsair had been relatively modest, but in 1898 Morgan commissioned a new vessel, Corsair II, which was much larger and more luxurious. It was 204 feet long, powered by steam, capable of crossing the Atlantic, furnished with the same attention to beauty and comfort that characterized his home. The yacht had multiple staterooms for guests, a dining room that could seat a dozen, a library, even a small organ for music. The hull was black, the fittings were brass that was kept polished to a mirror shine, and when the Corsair moved through the waters off Manhattan or Long Island, everyone knew whose yacht it was. Morgan used the yacht constantly for business. There was something about being aboard, away from offices and formal settings, that made negotiations easier. He would invite business associates for cruises, sometimes for an afternoon, sometimes for days, sailing along the coast while discussing railroad reorganizations or bond issues or the formation of new companies. The yacht was neutral territory, relaxing but still controlled by Morgan, and people found themselves agreeing to terms aboard the Corsair that they might have resisted in a Wall Street office. It was informal coercion, social pressure applied with velvet courtesy, and it was remarkably effective. Among the business relationships Morgan cultivated during the 1890s, one of the most important and complex was with Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie was older than Morgan by 2 years and had taken a very different path to wealth. Where Morgan was a banker, Carnegie was an industrialist, a self-made man who had built an empire in steel through relentless cost-cutting, vertical integration, and sheer force of will. Carnegie steel mills in Pittsburgh produced more steel than any other company in America, perhaps in the world. His fortune was enormous and growing. The two men respected each other, but there was also tension. Carnegie, despite his immense wealth, was not quite accepted by New York's old money elite in the way Morgan was. He was seen as rough, too focused on profit, lacking the cultivation and taste that Morgan embodied. Carnegie, for his part, saw Morgan as representing the parasitic financial class, people who made money by moving money around rather than by actually making anything. He paid Morgan grudging respect but also criticized the fees that bankers charged, arguing that they extracted value without creating it. Yet they needed each other. Carnegie needed access to capital markets when he wanted to expand his operations, and Morgan controlled those markets. Morgan, meanwhile, recognized that Carnegie Steel was an extraordinarily profitable enterprise, and that any investment in steel would have to reckon with Carnegie's dominance. They circled each other through the 1890s, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing, always wary, always assessing whether the other might prove useful or threatening. In 1895, Morgan's growing power received dramatic confirmation when he effectively saved the United States Treasury from insolvency. This episode, known as the Gold Crisis, demonstrated both Morgan's extraordinary capabilities and the precarious state of American government finance in an era before the Federal Reserve or strong central banking institutions. The problem was this: the United States was on the gold standard, which meant that paper currency could be redeemed for gold at a fixed rate. The Treasury was required to maintain a reserve of at least $100 million in gold to back the currency in circulation. But during the economic depression that followed the Panic of 1893, people began redeeming paper currency for gold, either because they mistrusted paper money or because they wanted to export gold to take advantage of higher prices abroad. The Treasury's gold reserve was depleting rapidly. By February of 1895, it had fallen below $60 million and was dropping by the day. If the gold reserve was exhausted, the consequences would be catastrophic. The dollar would become worthless. International trade would halt. The entire monetary system would collapse. President Grover Cleveland, a conservative Democrat who believed deeply in maintaining the gold standard, was desperate but had few options. Congress was controlled by silver interests who opposed measures to support gold. The government couldn't simply print more money without gold backing. That would trigger the very crisis they were trying to avoid. Cleveland turned to Morgan. Actually, Morgan essentially forced his way into the situation, travelling to Washington unbidden and demanding a meeting with the president. The meeting was tense. Cleveland didn't want to be seen as surrendering to Wall Street, didn't want to give Morgan the satisfaction of being the saviour. But Morgan laid out the reality. The Treasury was losing gold so rapidly that it would be completely depleted within days, perhaps hours. Unless something was done immediately, the government would be bankrupt. Morgan proposed a solution. He would personally arrange a purchase of gold from European sources, would use his banking connections to bring gold to America, would sell government bonds in exchange for that gold, replenishing the Treasury's reserves. The syndicate he would organise would purchase $62 million worth of government bonds, paying in gold, and would guarantee that the gold would not immediately flow back out of the Treasury. This last point was crucial. There was no point in bringing in gold if it would just be withdrawn again by speculators. The negotiations were complex and the terms were controversial. Morgan's syndicate would profit from the transaction. They were buying bonds below market value and would resell them at higher prices. Morgan himself would make approximately $300,000, and his firm would gain prestige and influence. Critics called it gouging, extracting profit from the government's distress. But Morgan argued, not entirely incorrectly, that he was taking real risk. If he couldn't deliver the gold, or if the gold immediately flowed out again, the syndicate would lose money and Morgan's reputation would be destroyed. Cleveland, having no better alternative, agreed. Morgan returned to New York and immediately began working his international connections, coordinating with European banks, arranging gold shipments, organising the complex logistics of moving millions of dollars worth of gold across the Atlantic. Within weeks, the gold arrived. The Treasury's reserves were replenished. The crisis passed. The dollar was saved. The episode solidified Morgan's reputation as the man who could accomplish what governments could not, who had the resources and connections and authority to solve problems that seemed insoluble. He had saved the United States Treasury. The government owed him, and everyone in American finance understood that Pierpont Morgan was now the most powerful private citizen in the country, more powerful in economic matters than any elected official, more essential to the functioning of the financial system than any institution. As the 1890s drew toward their close, Morgan was at the height of his influence. He was 60 years old in 1897, his face increasingly disfigured by the skin disease that had plagued him since youth, his nose grotesquely swollen and red, his appearance almost frightening to those who didn't know him. But those who did business with him looked past the physical affliction to see the penetrating intelligence, the iron will, the absolute confidence that characterized everything he did. He moved through the world with complete assurance, surrounded by art and beauty, conducting business from his yacht or his office or his library, making decisions that affected millions of people, accumulating wealth not for its own sake, but as a means to acquire more beauty, more art, more of the treasures of human civilization that he loved so deeply. The new century was approaching, and with it would come Morgan's greatest achievements and his greatest controversies, the moments when his power would be most visibly exercised and most fiercely debated. But all of that was still ahead, for now, as the 1800s gave way to the 1900s, Pierpont Morgan stood unchallenged, the acknowledged master of American finance, the banker more powerful than presidents. As the 20th century arrived, the American steel industry was a sprawling, competitive, somewhat chaotic enterprise dominated by one man who was growing tired of competition. Andrew Carnegie, now 65 years old, had spent decades building Carnegie Steel into the most efficient, most profitable steel company in the world. His mills in Pittsburgh produced steel rails, steel beams, steel wire, steel plates, all the products that were quite literally building modern America. His fortune was estimated at somewhere between $200 and $400 million, though no one knew exactly because Carnegie Steel was privately held, its finances known only to Carnegie and his partners. But Carnegie was growing weary. He had spent his life accumulating wealth, proving that a poor Scottish immigrant could become one of the richest men in America through intelligence and hard work. He had proven his point. Now he wanted to enjoy his wealth, to spend time at his castle in Scotland, to give away his money to libraries and universities and causes he believed in. He had even published an essay called Quote Zero, arguing that rich men had a moral duty to distribute their fortunes for the public good before they died. Carnegie wanted to retire, to step away from the daily management of steel production, to become a philanthropist and man of leisure. The problem was that Carnegie Steel, for all its success, was structured in a way that made retirement complicated. It was a partnership, not a corporation. Carnegie owned the majority of the shares, but dozens of partners owned smaller stakes. Selling his shares back to the company would be impossibly expensive for the remaining partners. Selling to outsiders would mean bringing in people Carnegie didn't trust to run his creation. He was trapped by his own success, unable to cash out without destroying what he had built. Meanwhile, other steel companies were proliferating. Federal Steel, National Steel, American Steel and Wire, National Tube. These were smaller than Carnegie Steel but substantial enterprises, each controlling certain segments of the steel market. Many of them were backed by or affiliated with Pierpont Morgan, who had been quietly investing in the steel industry, recognizing its fundamental importance to the American economy. Morgan had helped finance several of these companies, had installed professional managers, had brought the same organizing principles to steel that he had earlier brought to railroads. But the steel industry remained fragmented, competitive, prone to price wars that benefited no one. Each company tried to expand into the other's territories, building redundant facilities, cutting prices to gain market share, engaging in the kind of wasteful competition that Morgan found economically irrational. What the industry needed, Morgan believed, was consolidation, rationalization, the kind of systematic organization that would eliminate waste and create stable, predictable profits. In December of 1900, a dinner was held at the University Club in Manhattan, one of those gatherings of wealthy businessmen that were common in Gilded Age New York. Among the guests was Charles Schwab, Carnegie's 38-year-old protege and the president of Carnegie Steel. Schwab was brilliant, energetic, optimistic, a salesman as much as a steelmaker. He had risen from humble origins to become Carnegie's most trusted lieutenant, and Carnegie treated him almost as a son, certainly with more affection and respect than Carnegie showed to most people. After dinner, Schwab gave a speech. He talked about the future of the steel industry, about the possibilities if the various competing companies could be brought together into a single enterprise. He described how such a consolidation could eliminate duplication, could ensure that each mill produced what it was best suited to produce, could create economies of scale that would reduce costs and increase profits. He painted a vision of a steel company so large, so efficient, so dominant, that it could compete with European producers and supply all of America's growing needs for steel. Among those listening was Pierpont Morgan. He had not been particularly focused on steel before that evening, had seen it as one investment among many. But as Schwab talked, Morgan began to see the possibilities. A great steel company, properly organized, could be monumentally profitable. It could rationalize an entire industry. It could be, Morgan realized, the crown jewel of American industry, a monument to organizational efficiency and scale. And it could be the world's first billion-dollar corporation, a symbolic milestone that would announce America's arrival as the world's leading industrial power. After the speech, Morgan approached Schwab. They talked briefly about the ideas Schwab had outlined. Morgan asked questions, probing questions about Carnegie's willingness to sell, about the other steel companies and whether they could be acquired, about the technical possibilities of coordination between different types of steel production. Schwab, who had not expected this level of interest, found himself energized by Morgan's attention. Here was the most powerful banker in America, suddenly interested in the steel industry, suddenly thinking about the kind of consolidation that Schwab had been dreaming about. Over the following weeks, Morgan and Schwab met several more times, always quietly, always privately. Morgan was beginning to see how the deal could be structured. He would need to buy Carnegie steel, that was essential. Because no steel consolidation would mean anything without Carnegie's efficient mills and enormous production capacity. Then he would need to acquire the other major steel companies, bringing them all together under unified management and ownership. The result would be a company that controlled perhaps 60 or 70% of American steel production. A near monopoly, though not technically a complete one. The obstacle was Carnegie. Would he sell? At what price? And would he trust Morgan enough to negotiate in good faith? The two men had a complicated relationship, respectful but marked by mutual suspicion. Carnegie thought Morgan represented everything wrong with finance capitalism, making money by manipulating securities rather than by actually producing anything. Morgan thought Carnegie was brilliant at running steel mills but didn't understand the broader financial and organizational possibilities that consolidation could create. The approach to Carnegie was delicate and required Schwab as intermediary. Schwab, who knew Carnegie better than anyone, understood that the old man needed to feel that selling was his own idea, not something imposed by outsiders. Schwab began talking to Carnegie about retirement, about the pleasures of giving away his fortune, about the burden of continuing to manage a huge enterprise. He mentioned carefully that Morgan was interested in the steel industry, that perhaps Carnegie Steel could be sold as part of a larger consolidation, that this might be Carnegie's opportunity to finally cash out and begin his philanthropic career in earnest. Carnegie was intrigued but suspicious. He asked Schwab what Morgan was willing to pay. Schwab said he didn't know, that it would depend on Carnegie's price. Carnegie thought for a while, then did some calculations. Not detailed financial analysis, but rough estimates based on Carnegie Steel's earning power and its assets. He arrived at a figure, $480 million. This was an enormous sum, far more than anyone had ever paid for a single company. But Carnegie believed his steel company was worth it, believed that its earning power justified the price. According to the story that became famous, Carnegie wrote the figure on a slip of paper during a golf game with Schwab at the St. Andrews Golf Club in Westchester County. $480 million. He handed the paper to Schwab. Schwab took it to Morgan. Morgan looked at the number for a moment, sitting at his desk in his office at 23 Wall Street. The desk that was as always completely clear except for this single slip of paper, with this single staggering number written on it. Then Morgan nodded. Quote 1, he said. Just those two words. No negotiation, no haggling, no request for detailed financial justification. Morgan had decided that Carnegie Steel was worth $480 million. And that was the end of it. But the acceptance was just the beginning of an enormously complex transaction. Morgan now needed to acquire not just Carnegie Steel, but also Federal Steel, National Steel, American Steel and Wire, National Tube, American Steel Hoop, American Tin Plate, and several smaller companies. Each acquisition required negotiation, required assessing the value of each company, required convincing shareholders to accept Morgan's terms, required coordination of competing interests and egos. Morgan assembled a team to handle the details. His partners at J.P. Morgan and Company worked with lawyers and accountants to value each company, to structure the transactions, to create the legal framework for the new consolidated enterprise. Morgan himself focused on the biggest negotiations, using his authority and reputation to convince reluctant sellers that this consolidation was inevitable, that they could either participate on good terms or be left out and eventually crushed by the new steel giant. The financial structure of the deal was complex. Morgan was creating a new company, United States Steel Corporation, that would issue stock and bonds to purchase all these existing companies. Sellers would receive securities in the new company rather than cash, stock and bonds that represented ownership in this massive new enterprise. The question was how to value everything. How many shares of US Steel stock was Carnegie Steel worth? How many shares for Federal Steel? How to balance the claims of dozens of different groups of shareholders while creating a capital structure that would be manageable going forward. Morgan decided on a capitalization of $1.4 billion for United States Steel. This was the total value of all the stock and bonds that would be issued. About half of this represented the actual physical assets of the combined companies: mills, equipment, iron ore deposits, rail lines, ships on the Great Lakes for transporting ore. The other half represented goodwill and expected future earnings, the value of bringing all these companies together, the efficiencies that would be realized, the market power that would result from consolidation. Critics called this half water, meaning the stock was watered down, overcapitalized, representing value that didn't really exist except in Morgan's confident projections of future profits. But Morgan was confident. He believed that proper organization and management could create value, that the whole would be worth more than the sum of its parts, that United States Steel would be so efficient and powerful that the stock would be worth what he said it was worth. This was Morgan's genius, or perhaps his audacity, the belief that he could create value through sheer force of organization and will, that his judgment about what something should be worth would become reality because people trusted his judgment. The negotiations consumed the first months of 1901. Meeting followed meeting. Details were hammered out. Lawyers drafted documents running to hundreds of pages. Shareholders voted to accept the terms Morgan offered. One by one, the pieces fell into place. Carnegie got his $480 million, paid in bonds of the new US Steel Corporation, bonds that would pay him interest of approximately $15 million per year for the rest of his life. The other companies got their shares of stock. Morgan and his fellow bankers got fees totaling approximately $60 million for organizing the transaction, an enormous sum but consistent with the scale of what they had accomplished. On March 3rd, 1901, United States Steel Corporation was formally incorporated in New Jersey. The announcement made headlines across America and around the world. A billion-dollar corporation had been created. Nothing like it had ever existed before. US Steel controlled approximately 67% of American steel production. It employed over 160,000 workers. It owned mines and mills and railroads and ships. It was a colossus, a monument to industrial consolidation, a symbol of American economic power. Public reaction was mixed. Some celebrated the creation of US Steel as a triumph of American industry, as proof that American companies could compete with anything Europe could produce, as evidence that the modern corporation could achieve scales of organization previously unimaginable. Newspapers described Morgan as a genius of finance, a man who could envision and execute transactions of unprecedented complexity. He was compared to Napoleon, to Caesar, to the great empire builders of history. Others were horrified. They saw US Steel as a dangerous monopoly, as proof that wealth and power were concentrating in fewer and fewer hands, as evidence that democracy was being undermined by plutocracy. The progressive reformers who were gaining influence in American politics saw US Steel as exactly the kind of corporate giant that needed to be regulated or broken up. The sheer size of the company seemed threatening, seemed to give Morgan and a handful of bankers and managers control over an essential industry, control that could be used to raise prices, to crush competitors, to exploit workers. For Carnegie, there was satisfaction mixed with regret. He had gotten his price, had become even wealthier than before, could now devote himself full-time to giving away his fortune. He established libraries across America and Britain, funded universities and concert halls, endowed research institutions, wrote books about his philosophy of wealth and responsibility. But he also reportedly said later, only half joking, that he should have asked Morgan for $100 million more. Morgan would have paid it, Carnegie believed, because Morgan wanted US Steel that badly, wanted the prestige of creating the billion-dollar corporation, wanted the crown jewel of American industry. Perhaps Carnegie was right. Morgan wasn't much concerned with the price he paid. What mattered to him was accomplishment, was creating something unprecedented, was bringing order and efficiency to an industry that had been chaotic and wasteful. He had done with steel what he had earlier done with railroads, imposed organization, eliminated redundancy, created systems that worked efficiently. That this also made him wealthier and more powerful was pleasant, but almost secondary. Morgan was driven by something beyond simple accumulation of wealth. He was driven by the aesthetic satisfaction of organization, by the intellectual pleasure of solving complex problems, by the desire to be remembered as the man who built great enterprises. In the months after US Steel's formation, Morgan continued his routine, arriving at his office at 10 o'clock, keeping his desk empty, smoking his cigars, playing solitaire when thinking through problems. But now, when he sat at that empty desk, he was the man who had created the world's first billion-dollar corporation. His power and influence had reached a level that perhaps even he had not quite anticipated. He was 64 years old, at the absolute peak of his capabilities and authority. And the greatest test of that authority, the moment when he would quite literally save the American financial system through personal intervention, was just 6 years away. Waiting for him in the autumn of 1907. For now, let that image settle. Morgan at his desk in 1901, the architect of US Steel, surrounded by his art and his accomplishments, secure in his power, confident in his judgment, commanding an empire of finance that reached into every corner of American industry. The steel mills were running, producing the rails and beams and plates that were building skyscrapers and bridges and railroads across the growing nation. The workers were at their furnaces and rolling mills. The investors held their stock certificates, hoping Morgan's vision of efficiency and profit would be realized. And Morgan himself, the man who had brought it all together, sat at his empty desk and contemplated what he had built, what he would build next, and how he would use the extraordinary power he had accumulated to shape the financial system that was, whether anyone wanted to admit it or not, increasingly dependent on his decisions and his will. The years between 1901 and 1907 were prosperous ones for America and for Pierpont Morgan. United States Steel, despite initial skepticism, proved successful. The company paid dividends, the stock held its value, and Morgan's reputation as an organizational genius was confirmed. He continued reorganizing railroads, financing industrial enterprises, advising corporations on their financial structures. His art collection grew steadily, his library expanded, his yacht carried him along the coast on business and pleasure cruises. Life was ordered, predictable, profitable. But underneath this prosperity, forces were building that would create the most severe financial crisis America had faced since the 1890s, and that would test Morgan's powers more thoroughly than anything he had yet experienced. To understand what happened in October of 1907, we need to understand the financial landscape of early 20th century America, particularly the curious institutions called trust companies. Banks, as most people understood them, were relatively simple institutions. They took deposits from customers, paid modest interest on those deposits, and lent the money out at higher interest rates to borrowers. The difference between what they paid depositors and what they charged borrowers was their profit. Banks were regulated, at least to some degree. They were required to maintain reserves, A percentage of their deposits had to be kept in cash or other liquid assets so they could pay depositors who wanted to withdraw money. They were examined periodically by state or federal authorities. They were expected to be conservative, to make safe loans to reliable borrowers, to avoid speculation. Trust companies were different. They had originally been created to manage trusts, legal arrangements where one person would hold assets on behalf of another, perhaps managing an estate for an orphan or a widow. But over time, trust companies had evolved into something else. They still managed trusts, but they also accepted deposits like banks, made loans like banks, and invested in securities like investment houses. They were, in effect, doing everything that banks did, but with much less regulation and much lower reserve requirements. This made trust companies attractive to depositors because they could pay higher interest rates than banks. They kept less money in reserve, so they had more to lend out at profit. It made them attractive to borrowers because they were willing to make riskier loans that conservative banks would decline. And it made them attractive to investors because trust companies could invest in stocks and bonds and speculative ventures that banks were prohibited from touching. Trust companies were the shadow banking system of the early 20th century, less regulated, more innovative, and much more dangerous when things went wrong. By 1907, trust companies held deposits totaling about $1 billion, roughly equal to the deposits in New York's national banks. The largest trust companies were substantial institutions with impressive headquarters and distinguished boards of directors. The Knickerbocker Trust Company, for instance, was the third largest trust company in New York, with deposits of approximately $60 million and headquarters in a beautiful building at Fifth Avenue and 34th Street. Its president was Charles Barney, a respected financier married to the daughter of William Collins Whitney, one of New York's most prominent businessmen. The Knickerbocker seemed as solid as any financial institution in America. The economy in 1907 was showing some strain after years of rapid growth. Stock prices had risen steadily through 1905 and 1906, driven partly by genuine economic expansion, but also by speculation. People buying stocks not because they believed in the underlying companies, but because they expected prices to keep rising. This is always dangerous because markets driven by speculation rather than fundamentals are prone to sudden reversals when confidence wavers. In the spring and summer of 1907, there were tremors. The stock market declined somewhat. Some corporations that had borrowed heavily found themselves unable to service their debts. A few banks failed, though nothing that threatened the system as a whole. Interest rates began rising as credit became tighter. But these were seen as normal corrections, the kind of cyclical adjustments that economies experience regularly. Few people anticipated what was about to unfold. The trigger, when it came, involved copper. Copper was a crucial industrial metal, used in electrical wiring and telephone lines and countless manufacturing processes. The price of copper was rising in 1907, and this attracted speculators. Among them was a financier named F. Augustus Heinze, who controlled some copper mines in Montana and believed he could manipulate the stock price of United Copper Company to his advantage. Heinze, working with his brother and with a banker named Charles Morse, attempted what was called a corner. The concept of a corner is simple in theory, though difficult in practice. If you can buy up most of the available shares of a stock, you can control the price. People who have sold the stock short, essentially betting that the price will fall, will eventually need to buy shares to cover their positions. If you own most of the shares, they'll have to buy from you at whatever price you demand. It's a way of squeezing short sellers, forcing them to pay exorbitant prices, making enormous profits in the process. But corners are risky. They require accurate knowledge of how many shares are actually available. If you miscalculate if there are more shares outstanding than you thought, then instead of controlling the market, you've simply bought a lot of stock at high prices, with no one forced to buy from you at even higher prices. You're left holding expensive shares that you need to sell, and when you try to sell them, the price collapses, and you lose everything you invested plus everything you borrowed to make the attempt. This is what happened to the Heinze brothers in October of 1907. On Monday, October 14th, they began aggressively buying United Copper stock, trying to corner the market. The stock price rose sharply, from $39 per share to $52, then to $60. It looked like the corner was working. But on Tuesday, October 15th, it became apparent that the Heinzes had miscalculated. There were far more shares available than they had thought. Short sellers could cover their positions without buying from the Heinze brothers at inflated prices. The corner collapsed. United Copper stock plummeted, falling to $10 per share. The Heinze brothers and their associates had lost millions of dollars. Ordinarily, a failed stock speculation, even one this dramatic, would have limited ripple effects. The speculators would be ruined, but the broader financial system would continue. But in October of 1907, the connections between different parts of the financial system turned a stock manipulation failure into something much more dangerous. Charles Morse, one of the failed speculators, was president of the Bank of North America. The Heinze brothers had connections to several other banks. When news spread that these men had lost millions in the United Copper corner, depositors at banks associated with them began to worry. If the bank presidents were making such reckless bets, was their money safe? On Thursday, October 17th, runs began on several small banks associated with the failed speculators. Depositors lined up to withdraw their money, not because they had definite knowledge that the banks were failing, but simply because they were afraid. And fear in banking is self-fulfilling. Even a perfectly sound bank will fail if all its depositors demand their money simultaneously, because banks don't keep all deposits in cash. They lend most of it out. A bank run destroys the bank regardless of whether the initial fear was justified. By the weekend of October 19th and 20th, several of these smaller banks had failed or been absorbed by larger institutions. The immediate crisis seemed contained. But then attention turned to the Knickerbocker Trust Company. Charles Barney, the Knickerbocker's president, was known to be a business associate of Charles Morse. The Knickerbocker had not been directly involved in the copper speculation, had not lost money in the corner attempt, but the association was enough to make people nervous. On Monday, October 21st, a trickle of withdrawals began at the Knickerbocker. By Tuesday morning, the trickle had become a stream. By Tuesday afternoon, hundreds of depositors were lined up outside the Knickerbocker's headquarters, waiting to withdraw their money. The Knickerbocker's board of directors met in emergency session. They forced Charles Barney to resign, hoping this would restore confidence by cutting ties with Morse and the failed speculators. But it didn't help. If anything, Barney's forced resignation suggested that the board thought the Knickerbocker was in serious trouble. The run accelerated. By late Tuesday afternoon, the Knickerbocker had paid out millions of dollars to frighten depositors and could no longer meet the demand. At 3 o'clock, the Knickerbocker suspended operations, its doors closed. Depositors still in line were told to go home, that there was no more cash available, that they would have to wait and hope that eventually, after the Knickerbocker's assets were liquidated, they might recover some portion of their deposits. The Knickerbocker's failure sent shockwaves through New York's financial community. This wasn't some small bank in a poor neighborhood. This was the Knickerbocker, the third largest trust company in New York, with $60 million in deposits, with a board that included some of the most prominent names in New York society. If the Knickerbocker could fail, what trust company was safe? What bank was safe? The panic, which had been contained to institutions directly connected to the failed copper corner, suddenly threatened to engulf the entire financial system. Wednesday. October 23rd saw runs begin on other trust companies. The Trust Company of America, the second largest in New York, faced lines of depositors demanding withdrawals. The Lincoln Trust Company faced similar runs. People were pulling money out of institutions that were perfectly sound, that had made no risky investments, that had violated no rules or principles of prudent banking. Simply because fear was spreading and no one knew which institution might fail next. And here's where the story turns to Pierpont Morgan. On the evening of Saturday, October 19th, when the crisis was just beginning, Morgan had been in Richmond, Virginia, attending the Triennial Convention of the Episcopal Church. Morgan was deeply religious in a formal, conventional way. He attended church regularly, served on Episcopal boards and committees, gave generously to church causes. The convention was important to him, and he had planned to stay through its conclusion. But on Monday evening, October 21st, as the Knickerbocker run was building toward its climax, Morgan received urgent telegrams from his partners in New York. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. His presence was needed. On Tuesday morning, while the Knickerbocker was suspending operations, Morgan boarded a train for New York. He arrived late Tuesday night, went directly to his home on Madison Avenue, and met with his partners to assess the situation. What Morgan learned was deeply alarming. The trust companies were failing. The panic was spreading. And critically, there was no institution capable of stopping it. America in 1907 had no central bank, no Federal Reserve to serve as lender of last resort, no government entity with the resources and authority to stabilize the financial system in a crisis. The closest thing to such an institution was the New York Clearing House, a private association of banks that coordinated check clearing and occasionally took collective action during financial emergencies. But the clearinghouse represented banks, not trust companies, and its members were actually somewhat pleased to see trust companies, which they viewed as reckless competitors, getting into trouble. If the financial system was going to be saved, it would have to be saved by private individuals taking private action, using their own resources and their personal authority to restore confidence and provide liquidity to failing institutions. And in October of 1907, there was only one man in America with sufficient resources, sufficient authority, and sufficient respect across the financial community to attempt such a rescue. That man was Pierpont Morgan. On Wednesday morning, October 23rd, Morgan established his headquarters not at his office on Wall Street, but at his library. The Pierpont Morgan Library, which he had completed just 2 years earlier, stood next to his Madison Avenue home, a beautiful Renaissance-style building designed by McKim, Mead and White, faced with pink Tennessee marble, filled with Morgan's priceless collection of books and manuscripts and art. It was, in a sense, Morgan's temple to beauty and culture, the physical manifestation of everything he valued beyond business and money. But now, for the duration of the crisis, the library would become the command center for saving the American financial system. Morgan's partners began arriving Wednesday morning. George Perkins, one of his most trusted associates, who had helped organize the US Steel transaction. Henry Davison, young and energetic, partner at J.P. Morgan and Company. Benjamin Strong, who ran the Bankers Trust Company. James Stillman, president of National City Bank, the largest bank in New York. Other bank presidents, trust company directors, representatives from the clearinghouse. They gathered at the library because everyone understood that if a solution was to be found, it would be found here, with Morgan presiding. The library itself was extraordinary. The main room, called the West Room, was 40 feet long with a ceiling that soared 25 feet high. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with shelves holding rare books and manuscripts, medieval illuminated texts, first editions of English literature, ancient classical manuscripts. The ceiling was decorated with elaborate paintings and carved details. 3 large Renaissance paintings hung on the walls. The fireplace was framed by 16th century Italian marble. It was a room designed to inspire awe, to remind anyone who entered of the accumulated wisdom and beauty of human civilization. Morgan sat at his desk in this room, receiving reports, asking questions, making decisions. He was 70 years old. His nose grotesquely disfigured by the skin disease that had plagued him all his life, his body showing signs of age and the toll of decades of stress. But his mind was sharp, his will undiminished. He understood immediately what needed to be done, understood that the panic had to be stopped before it destroyed the entire financial structure of the country. The immediate problem was the Trust Company of America. which was facing massive withdrawals and would run out of cash within hours if not supported. Morgan sent his associates to examine the trust company's books to determine whether it was fundamentally sound or whether it had made bad loans that justified its failure. This was crucial. Morgan was willing to support solvent institutions facing temporary liquidity problems, but he would not throw good money after bad by supporting institutions that deserved to fail. The examiners worked through Wednesday afternoon and evening, poring over ledgers, assessing the quality of the Trust Company of America's loans and investments. Late Wednesday night, they reported back to Morgan. The Trust Company of America was sound. It had made conservative loans. Its assets exceeded its liabilities. The only problem was that those assets, loans to businesses and individuals, couldn't be converted to cash instantly, while depositors wanted their cash immediately. It was a liquidity crisis, not a solvency crisis. Morgan decided the Trust Company of America must be saved. He called together the presidents of the major banks and convinced them to pool resources to create an emergency loan of $25 million to the Trust Company of America, allowing it to meet the withdrawal demands and hopefully stem the panic. The banks were reluctant. Why should they risk their own funds to save a competitor? But Morgan's force of personality, his prestige, and his argument that the failure of a major trust company would threaten all of them eventually convinced them. The loan was arranged. The Trust Company of America survived Thursday, October 24th. But the crisis was far from over. Even as the Trust Company of America was being stabilized, other institutions were coming under pressure. The New York Stock Exchange was facing its own crisis. Stock prices were falling as the panic spread. And many traders had borrowed money, so-called call loans, to buy stocks. As stock prices fell, lenders were demanding repayment of these call loans. But traders couldn't sell their stocks at current depressed prices without losing everything. And they couldn't repay the loans without selling the stocks. The stock exchange was on the verge of a complete collapse. Morgan received word on Thursday morning that unless the stock exchange could secure approximately $25 million in fresh loans within hours, it would have to close. The closing of the stock exchange would be catastrophic. It would signal that the financial system had completely broken down, would trigger runs on every bank and trust company in the city, would likely spread panic across the country. It absolutely could not be allowed to happen. Morgan called another meeting of the bank presidents. They gathered at the library Thursday afternoon. Morgan informed them that the stock exchange needed $25 million and needed it immediately. The presidents protested. They had just committed $25 million to the Trust Company of America. They couldn't possibly raise another $25 million so quickly. Their own reserves were being strained. Morgan listened to their objections, his face impassive, smoking his cigar. Then he stood up, walked to the library door and locked it. He put the key in his pocket. He told the assembled bankers that no one was leaving until they had agreed to raise the $25 million. The stock exchange would not close. They would find the money. For an hour, the bankers argued and negotiated, trying to determine how the $25 million could be divided among them, how much each bank would contribute, what securities they would accept as collateral. Morgan sat at his desk playing solitaire, apparently paying little attention to the negotiations, but he was listening, monitoring the discussion, and when the bankers seemed close to agreement, he would interject a comment or question that moved them closer to resolution. Finally, agreement was reached. Each bank would contribute based on its size and strength. The money would be raised. The stock exchange would stay open. Morgan unlocked the door. The bankers left to arrange the transfers. Within minutes, the $25 million was being delivered to the stock exchange. Lending resumed. The crisis at the exchange was averted, at least for that day. But the broader panic continued. The trust companies were still under pressure. Banks in other cities were beginning to face runs as the panic spread beyond New York. And Morgan, 70 years old, was just beginning what would be the most intense and consequential week of his life. A week when he would personally, almost single-handedly, prevent the complete collapse of the American financial system. Let that image settle for a moment. Morgan at his desk in his library, surrounded by medieval manuscripts and Renaissance paintings, playing solitaire while bankers argued in the background, making decisions that affected millions of people, using his personal authority to force cooperation among institutions that might have preferred to protect only themselves. The panic was building, fear spreading through the city and beyond, but here in this beautiful room filled with the artifacts of human civilization, one old man was methodically, patiently, working to hold the system together. The days that followed blurred together into a continuous crisis punctuated by brief periods of exhausted sleep. Morgan's library became the centre of American finance, the place where decisions were made that would determine whether the financial system survived or collapsed entirely. The routine that developed was both exhausting and, in a strange way, almost meditative. The same faces appearing day after day, the same problems approached from different angles. The same difficult negotiations conducted in rooms filled with cigar smoke and tension. Morgan himself maintained an almost preternatural calm. Each morning he would arrive at the library around 10 o'clock, having breakfasted at home and reviewed the latest telegrams reporting conditions in other cities. He would receive reports from the various committees examining troubled institutions. He would make decisions about which companies deserve support and which should be allowed to fail. And through it all he would play solitaire, the cards laid out on a small table near his desk, his thick fingers moving the cards with surprising delicacy, his mind apparently focused on the game while simultaneously processing everything being said around him. The solitaire wasn't a distraction. It was, those who knew him understood, his way of thinking. The mechanical act of playing freed his mind to work on problems, to see connections, to arrive at solutions. He would play hand after hand, sometimes for hours, and then suddenly he would look up and announce a decision with absolute finality. The matter was settled. Move to the next problem. The bankers and trust company presidents who gathered each day at the library developed a kind of gallows camaraderie. They were all exhausted, all frightened about what would happen if the panic couldn't be stopped, all frustrated by their powerlessness to act individually. Only collectively, and only under Morgan's direction, could they marshal sufficient resources to meet each new crisis as it emerged. They began to accept that Morgan's judgment would determine outcomes, that resistance was futile and probably counterproductive. If Morgan said an institution should be saved, it would be saved. If he decided it should fail, it would fail. This concentration of authority in one man was extraordinary, perhaps unprecedented, and yet under the circumstances it seemed necessary. Democracy was a luxury that financial panics didn't permit. The library itself was transformed during these days. The beautiful West Room, which Morgan normally reserved for his most precious manuscripts and for quiet contemplation, became a kind of war room. Additional tables were brought in for the committees examining the books of troubled institutions. Messengers arrived constantly with telegrams and reports. Telephones had been installed, their ringing breaking the usual quiet of the library. The smell of cigar smoke permeated everything, Morgan's cigars mixing with those of the dozens of bankers who spent hours in these rooms. In the adjoining East Room, separated from the West Room by a great bronze door, Morgan kept his most precious manuscripts. This room was even more spectacular than the West Room, its walls covered in red silk brocade, its ceiling decorated with signs of the zodiac painted in brilliant colours, its shelves holding manuscripts that included Gutenberg Bibles, illuminated books of hours created by medieval monks, letters written by George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. During the panic, this room became a kind of prison. When Morgan needed bankers to agree to difficult terms, to contribute money they didn't want to contribute, to accept losses they didn't want to accept, he would invite them into the East Room to negotiate. Then he would leave, closing the bronze door behind him, and the bankers would understand that they weren't leaving until they had reached agreement. The door wasn't literally locked, but psychologically it might as well have been. No one wanted to be the person who walked out, who refused to cooperate while the financial system collapsed. So they would sit in that beautiful room, surrounded by priceless artifacts of human civilization, and argue and negotiate until they found a solution Morgan would accept. This happened repeatedly during the week following the stock exchange crisis. On Friday, October 25th, a different trust company came under pressure and needed emergency support. Morgan assembled the necessary bankers, outlined the situation, and sent them to the East Room to work out the details. They emerged hours later with an agreement. The trust company survived. On Saturday, yes, banks and trust companies were open on Saturdays then. Another institution needed help. Same process. The bankers gathered, Morgan gave them their assignment, they negotiated, they emerged with a solution. By Sunday, October 27th, there was a brief sense that perhaps the worst had passed. The immediate runs had been stopped. The stock exchange remained open. The major trust companies were surviving day to day. The system was still fragile, still required constant attention and support, but it hadn't collapsed. Morgan allowed himself a few hours of rest on Sunday, attending church services as he always did, spending some time with his family. But by Sunday evening, he was back at the library, preparing for the week ahead. Monday brought a new and potentially catastrophic problem. The Tennessee Coal, Iron and Railroad Company, known as TC&I, was a substantial industrial company based in Birmingham, Alabama. It owned coal mines and iron ore deposits, operated steel mills, employed thousands of workers. It was the largest steel producer in the South, though still far smaller than US Steel. TC&I had borrowed heavily to finance expansion, including substantial loans from a major brokerage house called Moore & Schley. Moore & Schley, like many brokerage firms, had borrowed money through call loans to finance its operations and investments. The panic had made call loans difficult to obtain, and lenders were demanding repayment. Moore & Schley needed to raise cash quickly. The firm's largest asset was its loan to TC&I, secured by TC&I stock. But TC&I stock, like most stocks during the panic, had fallen sharply in value. If Moore & Schley tried to sell the TC&I stock to raise cash, the sale would depress the stock price further, and Moore & Schley would still not have enough cash to meet its obligations. The firm would fail, and its failure would likely trigger runs on banks that had lent money to Moore & Schley, and the panic would intensify just when it seemed to be stabilizing. Morgan's partners brought him this problem Monday evening. He listened, asked questions, thought while playing solitaire. The solution, he concluded, was for someone to buy TC&I, not just Moore & Schley shares, but the entire company, at a price high enough that Moore & Schley would survive. But who would buy an industrial company in the middle of a financial panic when credit was frozen and the economy was contracting? Only a company with sufficient resources and confidence to look beyond the immediate crisis. Morgan thought of US Steel. The corporation he'd created 6 years earlier was profitable, well capitalized, capable of acquiring TC&I without strain. And there would be strategic benefits. TC&I's coal and iron ore reserves in the South would complement US Steel's operations in the North. The acquisition made business sense even apart from the crisis it would solve. But there was a significant problem. US Steel already controlled roughly 67% of American steel production. Adding TC&I would increase that percentage. This might violate antitrust laws, particularly the Sherman Antitrust Act, which prohibited monopolies and restraints on trade. President Theodore Roosevelt had made trust busting a centerpiece of his administration. He had prosecuted Northern Securities, a railroad holding company, under the Sherman Act. He had established a reputation as a progressive reformer willing to challenge corporate power. Would Roosevelt approve US Steel acquiring TC&I in the middle of a financial crisis? Or would he see it as Morgan trying to exploit the panic to expand his steel monopoly? Morgan decided this required direct consultation with the president. On Monday evening he called Elbert Gary and Henry Clay Frick to his library. Gary was chairman of US. Steel's board, a lawyer by training, dignified and diplomatic. Frick was a steel industry veteran, Carnegie's former partner, tough and pragmatic. Morgan explained the situation. TC&I needed to be acquired to prevent Moore and Schley's failure and the broader panic that would follow. US Steel was the only realistic buyer. But the acquisition might violate antitrust laws unless Roosevelt approved it. Gary and Frick would need to travel to Washington immediately, Morgan said. They would meet with Roosevelt first thing Tuesday morning. They would explain the situation. Emphasize that this was an emergency measure to prevent financial catastrophe, not a scheme to build monopoly power. They would ask for Roosevelt's assurance that the administration would not challenge the acquisition under antitrust laws, and they would need an answer quickly, because Moore and Schley was running out of time. Gary and Frick took the midnight train to Washington. They arrived early Tuesday morning, November 5th, and went directly to the White House. Roosevelt received them at breakfast. He was an early riser, famously energetic, already at work while most of Washington still slept. Gary and Frick, exhausted from a sleepless night on the train, explained the situation. Tennessee Coal and Iron was about to fail. Its failure would destroy Moore and Schley. That failure would trigger bank runs and intensify the panic. US. Steel was willing to acquire TC&I to prevent this chain of disaster, but needed assurance that the acquisition wouldn't be challenged as a violation of antitrust laws. Roosevelt listened, asked questions, considered. He understood that the financial panic was serious, that more bank failures could have political consequences as well as economic ones. On the other hand, he had built his reputation on challenging corporate power, on preventing exactly the kind of consolidation that this acquisition represented. He was torn between his progressive principles and the immediate necessity of stabilizing the financial system. According to the accounts that emerged later, Roosevelt ultimately decided that preventing financial collapse took precedence over antitrust concerns. He told Gary and Frick that while he could not give formal legal approval that would require a court ruling, he would not instruct the Department of Justice to challenge the acquisition. The administration would not interfere. US Steel could proceed. Gary and Frick immediately telegraphed Morgan. Approval granted. Morgan, who had been waiting at the library for word from Washington, moved quickly. He called together the directors of US Steel who were in New York. They met at the library Tuesday morning and voted to acquire Tennessee Coal and Iron, paying with US Steel stock valued at approximately $30 million. The terms were generous enough to save Moore and Schley from failure. By Tuesday afternoon, the deal was announced. Moore and Schley survived. The chain of failure that might have spread across Wall Street was broken. But this solution was controversial even at the time and would become more so in retrospect. Critics argued that Morgan had used the panic as cover to expand US Steel's monopoly power, that the acquisition of TC&I was more about industrial consolidation than crisis management, that Roosevelt had been manipulated into approving something he should have opposed. There was truth in these criticisms. Morgan certainly benefited from the acquisition, and US Steel's market dominance increased. But it's also true that without the acquisition, Moore and Schley would have failed, and that failure likely would have triggered additional runs and failures. Morgan had solved a genuine crisis in a way that also served his business interests. This was consistent with his entire career. Doing well by doing good, or doing good by doing well, depending on your perspective. Through all of this, through the days and nights of crisis management, Morgan maintained his routine as much as possible. He still played solitaire. He still smoked his cigars. He still kept his desk clear except for whatever single matter demanded his immediate attention. But the strain was visible. He was 70 years old, and he was working harder than he had worked in decades. His partners worried about his health, about whether the stress might literally kill him. But Morgan seemed sustained by the crisis, by being needed, by exercising the powers he had spent a lifetime accumulating. The nights were long. Often, negotiations would continue past midnight. Bankers would doze in chairs in the library while waiting for decisions. Morgan himself rarely showed signs of fatigue. He would sit at his desk or his card table, thinking, deciding, occasionally delivering pronouncements that everyone understood were final and not subject to debate. There was something almost elemental about those nights in the library. The most powerful men in American finance, gathered in rooms filled with the treasures of centuries, trying to prevent the modern financial system from destroying itself, all under the direction of one old man whose authority derived not from any official position, but simply from the fact that everyone recognized he was the only person capable of organizing a response. By the second week of November, the panic was clearly subsiding. The runs on trust companies had stopped. The stock exchange was functioning normally. Call loan rates, which had spiked to incredible levels during the worst days of the panic, were declining. Banks that had hoarded cash were beginning to lend again. Credit was flowing. The system was healing. On Saturday, November 9th, Morgan called a final meeting at his library. He thanked the bankers for their cooperation, acknowledged their sacrifices, and told them that the emergency appeared to be over. Individual institutions might still face difficulties, but the systemic crisis had passed. The financial structure had held. America had avoided the complete collapse that had seemed possible just weeks earlier. The bankers left the library that evening with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. They had been through an extraordinary experience, had seen the financial system come closer to complete failure than most of them had ever imagined possible, and had witnessed one man, through force of will, through careful judgment about what could be saved and what must be allowed to fail, through the intelligent deployment of collective resources, literally save American capitalism. Morgan himself felt satisfaction, but also perhaps something approaching emptiness. He had spent 3 weeks in almost constant crisis management. He had made decisions affecting millions of people. He had used every tool available to him, his personal wealth, his institutional authority, his power to convene and compel cooperation, his reputation for integrity and judgment. And it had worked. The panic of 1907 was over. The financial system survived. America would not slide into depression. But Morgan understood something that perhaps few others fully grasped. This couldn't happen again. The financial system couldn't continue to depend on the intervention of private individuals, no matter how wealthy or capable. What had been needed during the panic was a central bank, an institution with the resources and authority to serve as lender of last resort, to stabilize the system during crises, to provide the functions that Morgan had provided, but on a systematic, reliable, ongoing basis, rather than as an improvisation by an aging banker who happened to have sufficient prestige and wealth to command cooperation. The lessons of the panic of 1907 would eventually lead to the creation of the Federal Reserve System in 1913. But Morgan wouldn't live to see it. For now, in November of 1907, he could only survey what he had accomplished and wonder whether at 70 years old he would ever face another crisis of such magnitude. The answer, as it turned out, was no. The panic of 1907 was Morgan's last great triumph, the final dramatic demonstration of the extraordinary power he had built and the wisdom, or at least the effectiveness, with which he could wield it. Let that scene settle in your mind. Morgan at his desk in the library, late Saturday night after the final meeting, the other bankers departed, the crisis resolved, the magnificent room silent now except for the ticking of clocks and the sound of his breathing. Around him, the medieval manuscripts and Renaissance paintings, the accumulated beauty of centuries. Before him, the empty desk, clear and ready for whatever might come next. The panic was over. The system had survived. And Pierpont Morgan, the banker more powerful than presidents, had proven once again that when America's financial structure teetered on the edge of collapse, there was one man, and only one, who could pull it back from the abyss. The immediate aftermath of the panic of 1907 was a strange mixture of gratitude and unease. Morgan was hailed as the saviour of American finance. the man who had prevented complete collapse through personal intervention and leadership. Newspapers published laudatory articles. Business leaders sent letters of thanks. The general public, which had watched in fear as banks failed and the stock market plunged, breathed easier knowing that the crisis had been resolved. But underneath the gratitude, there was a growing discomfort with what the panic had revealed. One man, however capable, however well-intentioned, had held the power to determine which institution survived and which failed, who was saved and who was ruined. Morgan had made these decisions wisely, most people agreed, but the fact that such decisions rested on one man's judgment seemed dangerous, seemed contrary to democratic principles, seemed to suggest that American finance had become too concentrated, too dependent on the will of a few enormously wealthy individuals. This discomfort manifested in several ways. Progressive reformers, who were gaining political strength in both parties, began calling for government regulation of banking and finance. If the panic had demonstrated anything, they argued, it was that financial markets couldn't regulate themselves, that private interests wouldn't maintain stability without oversight, that the public interest required public institutions rather than relying on the benevolence of plutocrats like Morgan. Even people who admired what Morgan had done during the panic could see that the system he represented was inherently unstable. The most immediate response was legislative. In 1908, Congress passed the Aldrich-Vreeland Act, named for Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, who was coincidentally Morgan's son-in-law. Aldrich's daughter had married Morgan's son. The act was modest in scope, essentially allowing banks to issue emergency currency during financial crises, providing a mechanism for increasing the money supply when credit froze. It was a stopgap measure, acknowledging the need for systemic reform while not actually creating the kind of central banking system that many reformers believed was necessary. More significantly, the Aldrich-Vreeland Act created the National Monetary Commission, tasked with studying banking systems in America and Europe and recommending comprehensive reforms. The commission, chaired by Senator Aldrich, spent 3 years studying the problem, travelling to European capitals to examine how their central banks functioned, consulting with economists and bankers, and ultimately producing a proposal for an American central banking system. This proposal, after significant modification and political debate, would eventually become the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, creating the Federal Reserve System that still exists today. But Morgan wouldn't live to see the Federal Reserve created. Between 1907 and 1913, his health declined, his energy diminished, and his world, the world of personal banking based on individual relationships and trust, began to seem increasingly antiquated. The new century demanded new structures, institutional rather than personal, systematic rather than improvised. Morgan understood this intellectually, but it must have been difficult to accept emotionally. He had spent his entire life building personal authority, cultivating relationships, establishing his judgment as the standard by which financial decisions were made. And now that entire approach was being rendered obsolete by the very success it had achieved. Through these years, Morgan continued his routines. He still arrived at his office at 23 Wall Street each morning around 10 o'clock. He still played solitaire when thinking through problems. He still travelled to Europe regularly, still added to his art collection, still cruised on his yacht during pleasant weather. But increasingly he seemed to be going through motions, maintaining patterns established over decades even as the world around him changed in fundamental ways. His art collecting reached extraordinary levels during these final years. He was acquiring masterpieces at an unprecedented rate, buying entire collections, spending millions of dollars on paintings and sculptures and manuscripts and decorative arts. His library in New York could no longer hold everything he was acquiring. He had to rent additional warehouse space in London to store overflow. It was as though he was trying to surround himself completely with beauty, to build a fortress of artistic achievement against the modern world he increasingly found alien and inhospitable. In December of 1912, Morgan faced what would be his final great ordeal: testimony before a congressional committee investigating the so-called money trust. The committee was officially called the House Banking and Currency Committee, but it became known as the Peugeot Committee after its chairman, Arsène Peugeot, a Democratic representative from Louisiana. The committee's chief counsel was Samuel Untermyer, a New York lawyer and progressive reformer who had long been critical of concentrated financial power. The investigation had been ongoing for months, examining the relationships between major banks and corporations, trying to document how financial power was concentrated in the hands of a few men and institutions. The committee subpoenaed documents, interviewed bankers and corporate executives, and built a case that American finance was dominated by what they called the money trust, a small group of bankers who controlled credit and therefore controlled the entire economy. At the centre of this alleged trust, inevitably, was J.P. Morgan. Morgan was subpoenaed to testify. He arrived at the committee room on the morning of December 18, 1912, accompanied by lawyers but determined to speak for himself. He was 75 years old now, his health clearly declining, moving slowly, his famous penetrating gaze now clouded somewhat by age. But when he sat in the witness chair and faced Samuel Untermyer and the committee members, he was still Pierpont Morgan, still commanding, still convinced of the rightness of his life's work. The testimony lasted 2 days, with Morgan returning for additional questioning on December 19th. The exchanges have become famous, quoted in histories of American finance, because they revealed fundamental disagreements about the nature of banking and the role of trust in economic relationships. Untermyer, the lawyer, approached banking as a matter of rules and regulations and legal structures. Morgan approached it as a matter of character and personal relationships. Untermyer asked Morgan about his power to control credit. Didn't Morgan, through his bank and the other institutions he influenced, effectively decide who could borrow money and who couldn't? Didn't this give him enormous power over American business? Morgan acknowledged his influence but denied that it constituted control in any legal sense. He made recommendations. He gave advice. People were free to reject that advice, though admittedly few did because his judgment was respected. Then came the exchange that would be quoted most often. Untermyer asked whether commercial credit was based primarily on money or property. Morgan replied that it was based primarily on character. Untermyer pressed. Wasn't collateral, money or property pledged as security, the fundamental basis of credit? Morgan was firm. Quote 4, Untermyer seemed baffled. Quote 5. Morgan responded with what has become perhaps his most famous statement. Quote 6. This exchange captured the fundamental difference between Morgan's world and the world that was replacing it. Morgan believed that banking was ultimately about judging character, about knowing whom you could trust to honour obligations. You lent to people you trusted regardless of their collateral. You refused to lend to people you didn't trust, no matter how much collateral they offered. This was the personal banking of the 19th century, where relationships mattered more than balance sheets. But Untermyer and the progressives he represented believed that banking needed to be systematic, rule-based, impersonal. Character was too subjective, too easily manipulated by men of Morgan's class who could recognise character in people like themselves while denying it to immigrants or workers or people without the right social credentials. Modern banking needed to be based on objective criteria: assets, liabilities, credit histories, things that could be measured and regulated and made fair. Morgan's approach, however well it had worked for him, couldn't be the basis for a democratic financial system. The committee also questioned Morgan about his various directorships. He served on the boards of dozens of corporations, railroads, steel companies, banks, trust companies, insurance companies. Didn't these interlocking directorates create conflicts of interest? Didn't they allow Morgan to coordinate activities among supposedly competing companies? Didn't they concentrate too much power in too few hands? Morgan seemed genuinely puzzled by these questions. Of course he served on multiple boards. That's what responsible bankers did. They provided oversight, ensured competent management, protected investors' interests. The interlocking directorates were beneficial, not harmful. They brought coordination to industries that would otherwise be chaotic, brought experienced judgment to companies that needed guidance. What the committee saw as dangerous concentration of power, Morgan saw as efficient organization. The testimony was exhausting for Morgan. 2 full days of questioning, of having to explain and justify decisions he had made, of defending a career that he believed spoke for itself. His lawyers tried to keep the sessions short, concerned about his health and stamina. But Morgan insisted on answering fully, on defending not just himself but the entire system of personal banking that he represented. When the hearings finally ended, Morgan returned to New York depleted. Friends and associates who saw him in the weeks after his testimony remarked on how aged he seemed, how the experience had taken a toll. He had been treated not as the saviour who had prevented financial collapse in 1907, but as a potential criminal whose power threatened democracy. This wounded him more deeply than he acknowledged. Christmas of 1912 was subdued. Morgan spent it with family, trying to recover his strength and spirits. But by January of 1913, it was clear that his health was seriously declining. His doctors recommended a trip to Egypt. The warm, dry climate might help, and the change of scenery might restore his vitality. Morgan had always loved travel, had always found pleasure in visiting new places and examining ancient artifacts. Perhaps Egypt would revive him. He sailed in January accompanied by family and staff. The voyage across the Atlantic was rough, winter storms making the crossing uncomfortable. But Morgan brightened as the ship reached warmer waters, as the Mediterranean climate enveloped him. They arrived in Egypt in February and spent weeks touring ancient sites, the pyramids at Giza, the temples at Luxor, the Valley of the Kings. Morgan, who had collected Egyptian artifacts for decades, was now seeing their original context, walking among monuments that had stood for thousands of years. But the trip didn't restore his health. If anything, the exertion of travel seemed to weaken him further. By March, his family decided they should move to Rome, where medical care would be better than in Egypt. They settled into the Grand Hotel, and doctors were summoned. Morgan's condition was described as nervous exhaustion, a 19th century diagnosis that covered a multitude of ailments. Essentially, his body was simply giving out, worn down by 75 years of life, decades of stress, and the particular intensity of the previous 6 years. He spent his final days in Rome largely bedridden, occasionally sitting up to receive visitors or to look at the art books and catalogues that had always given him pleasure. His mind drifted between present and past, between the hotel room and the memories of a long life. He spoke occasionally of his library, of wanting to return to New York, of unfinished business, but mostly he was quiet, conserving what little strength remained. On the morning of March 31st, 1913, Pierpont Morgan died. He was 75 years old. The cause was officially listed as nervous exhaustion, though modern doctors might identify it as simply the accumulated effects of age and stress. He died in Rome, far from New York and the financial world he had dominated, surrounded by family but perhaps feeling very alone, the last representative of a banking system that was already becoming history. The news reached New York by telegraph and spread quickly through the financial district. The stock exchange closed early as a mark of respect. Flags were lowered to half-staff, messages of condolence poured in from around the world. Whatever criticisms had been levelled at Morgan, whatever discomfort people felt about the power he had wielded, there was genuine mourning for a man who had been a giant of American finance, who had shaped the modern economy, who had saved the financial system when it teetered on the brink of collapse. His body was returned to New York aboard a steamship, arriving in mid-April. The funeral was held at St. George's Episcopal Church, where Morgan had worshipped for decades. The church was filled with mourners, bankers and businessmen, politicians and clergy, family and friends. Outside, thousands of ordinary New Yorkers lined the streets, wanting to pay respects to a man who, whatever else he had been undeniably important to the city and the nation. The funeral service was simple and dignified, consistent with Episcopal tradition. There were hymns and prayers, a brief eulogy, then the procession to the cemetery where Morgan would be buried in the family plot in Hartford, Connecticut, the city where he'd been born 75 years earlier. The circle was complete. He had left Hartford as a young man to build an empire in New York and London, and now he returned for his final rest. In the weeks after his death, as his estate was settled, a surprising fact emerged. Morgan's personal fortune was valued at approximately $80 million. This was an enormous sum by any standard, equivalent to perhaps $2 billion in modern terms. But it was much less than most people had assumed. Many had believed Morgan was worth hundreds of millions, perhaps rivaling or exceeding Carnegie or Rockefeller. The revelation that his fortune was, quote, $880 million was shocking. What the estate valuation revealed was that Morgan had spent most of his money on art. His collection was valued at approximately $50 million, more than half of his total estate. He had accumulated one of the greatest private art collections in the world, spending freely on masterpieces, never worrying about price when he wanted something beautiful. The collection included paintings by Raphael, Vermeer, Rembrandt, and dozens of other masters. It included medieval manuscripts worth millions. It included ancient artifacts, Chinese porcelain, Renaissance sculpture, decorative arts from across centuries. His son, J.P. Morgan Jr., known as Jack, inherited the estate and faced difficult decisions about the collection. Much of it was eventually given to museums or sold. The Pierpont Morgan Library became a public institution, allowing scholars and visitors to see the extraordinary manuscripts and rare books that Morgan had accumulated. Major paintings went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and other institutions. Some pieces were sold to settle estate taxes and distribute the inheritance among family members. The dispersal of the collection was, in a way, consistent with Morgan's life. He had loved beautiful things, had surrounded himself with the achievements of human artistic genius, but he had never been possessive about them in the way he might have been possessive about money. He had wanted to appreciate beauty, to preserve it, to make it accessible to people who could understand and value it. The fact that after his death the collection was largely given to the public seems fitting, seems like the conclusion he would have wanted even if he didn't explicitly plan it. His death also marked a true ending of an era. Within months, Congress would pass the Federal Reserve Act, creating the central banking system that Morgan's career had demonstrated America needed. The personal banking of the 19th century, where relationships and character judgments determined outcomes, would be replaced by institutional banking, where rules and regulations and systematic procedures would govern. This was probably necessary, probably more fair, probably better suited to a modern democratic society. But something was lost too. The accountability that came from personal responsibility, the efficiency of decision-making by people with real knowledge and real stakes in outcomes, the capacity for quick, decisive action during crises. The world moved on without Morgan surprisingly quickly. His firm, J.P. Morgan & Company, continued under his son's leadership, but it was no longer the dominant force it had been under Pierpont. Other banks grew in importance. The financial system became more dispersed, less concentrated. This was by design. The Federal Reserve and the banking regulations that followed were explicitly intended to prevent another Morgan from accumulating such power. The system became more stable but perhaps less dynamic, more fair but perhaps less efficient. The trade-offs were complex, and there's no simple judgment about whether the change was entirely positive or negative. But for now, in the spring of 1913, the world was simply adjusting to Morgan's absence, mourning a figure who had been so large, so powerful, so central to American finance that his death left a vacuum that no individual would ever fill again. The age of the great individual banker was ending. The age of institutional finance was beginning, and Pierpont Morgan, buried in Hartford, surrounded by the memories of a long and consequential life, had served as the bridge between these eras, the last of one kind and the harbinger of another. Let that image rest. Morgan's grave in Hartford, the headstone simple and understated despite the magnitude of the life it marked, these seasons passing over it as the financial world he had dominated transformed itself into something he would barely have recognized. His library remained in New York, his art collection dispersed to museums, his firm continuing under his son's leadership but never quite the same. The empire he built had been personal, based on his judgment and authority, and without him it necessarily became something different, something more institutional and less individual, reflecting the new age that was dawning even as the old banker who embodied the previous age lay quiet beneath Connecticut soil. The firm that Morgan left behind continued to bear his name, but it operated in a world that was already transforming in ways he might not have fully anticipated. His son, J.P. Morgan Jr., Jack to family and close associates, assumed leadership of J.P. Morgan and Company. Jack was 56 years old when his father died, himself no longer a young man, and he had spent his entire adult life in his father's shadow. He was capable, conscientious, deeply committed to maintaining the firm's reputation and traditions, but he lacked his father's commanding presence, his father's instinctive grasp of power dynamics, his father's ability to dominate a room simply by entering it. Jack Morgan approached banking more cautiously than his father had, more concerned with maintaining what had been built than with expanding into new territories. This was partly temperament. Jack was naturally more conservative, but it also reflected changing times. The world that Pierpont Morgan had dominated, where personal relationships determined outcomes and individual judgment trumped institutional rules, was giving way to something more regulated, more systematic, more constrained by laws and government oversight. The Federal Reserve Act was signed into law in December of 1913, just 9 months after Pierpont Morgan's death. The Act created a central banking system that would perform many of the functions Morgan had performed during the Panic of 1907, serving as lender of last resort, stabilizing the financial system during crises, managing the money supply to moderate economic cycles. The Federal Reserve wasn't a single institution but a network of 12 regional banks, coordinated by a board of governors in Washington, a compromise between those who wanted strong central control and those who feared concentrating too much power in government hands. The creation of the Federal Reserve marked the end of the era when private individuals like Morgan could single-handedly determine the fate of the financial system. Now there was an institution with that responsibility, backed by government authority and funded by the banks themselves. This was what the Panic of 1907 had demonstrated was necessary. Morgan had saved the system, but everyone recognized that the system couldn't continue to depend on the benevolence and capability of whoever happened to be the most powerful banker at any given moment. Institutional solutions were required for systemic problems. But even as the Federal Reserve took shape, even as regulations multiplied and government oversight increased, the firm that Morgan had built continued to play a central role in American finance. And in 1914, just a year after Pierpont's death, the firm faced an entirely new kind of challenge when war erupted in Europe. The Great War, as it was called before anyone imagined there would be a second one, began in August of 1914 with Austria-Hungary's declaration of war on Serbia, quickly expanding to engulf most of Europe. Britain and France and Russia, the Allied powers, faced Germany and Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, the Central Powers. The United States remained neutral, at least officially, though American sympathies generally favoured the Allies, particularly Britain, with which America had extensive cultural and commercial ties. The war created enormous financial needs. Britain and France needed to buy weapons and ammunition and supplies from American manufacturers. They needed to feed their armies and maintain their economies while most of their workforce was in uniform. They needed money, enormous amounts of money, and the traditional European sources of credit were disrupted by the war itself. So they turned to America, and specifically to J.P. Morgan and Company. Jack Morgan and his partners negotiated loans to the Allied governments, totaling hundreds of millions of dollars, eventually billions. These weren't just financial transactions, but political acts, tying America's economic interest to Allied victory, creating a constituency of American bankers and investors who needed the Allies to win so the loans would be repaid. The Morgan firm organized syndicates of banks to share the risk, sold bonds to American investors, managed the flow of money from America to Britain and France. When America finally entered the war in April of 1917, the Morgan firm's role became even more central. The firm helped coordinate the American war effort's financial aspects, helped sell Liberty bonds to American citizens to fund the war, managed the complex logistics of moving American supplies and soldiers across the Atlantic. The war was catastrophic, millions dead, empires destroyed, European civilization traumatized. But it was also, from a purely financial perspective, profitable for the Morgan firm and for America generally. The United States emerged from the war as the world's leading creditor nation, having loaned billions to the Allies, while European nations emerged deeply in debt. But the war also changed America in ways that would affect banking and finance. The government's role in the economy expanded dramatically during the war. Federal spending increased tenfold. New agencies coordinated industrial production, regulated prices, managed labor relations. Americans became accustomed to government intervention in economic matters, to the idea that the state could and should organize resources for collective purposes. This wartime experience would influence attitudes toward government's role in the economy for decades. After the war through the 1920s, the Morgan firm continued to prosper during the decade of economic expansion and stock market boom. But the firm was no longer quite the dominant force it had been under Pierpont. Other banks had grown stronger. The Federal Reserve existed now to perform some of the coordinating functions that Morgan had once performed individually. And the financial world itself was becoming more democratic, with more investors, more securities, more complexity, more everything. One firm, however prestigious, could no longer dominate the way Pierpont Morgan's firm had dominated in 1907. The building at 23 Wall Street, the headquarters of J.P. Morgan and Company, remained a symbol of financial power. It was a modest 4-story structure, dwarfed by newer, taller buildings being constructed around it. But everyone in finance knew what happened inside. Knew that decisions made at 23 Wall Street still shaped outcomes across the economy. The building's very modesty was a kind of power statement. We don't need an imposing skyscraper, the architecture seemed to say, because our influence speaks for itself. On September 16th, 1920, at noon on a workday when Wall Street was crowded with workers returning from lunch, a bomb exploded directly in front of 23 Wall Street. The blast killed 38 people, injured hundreds more, shattered windows throughout the financial district, and left the Morgan building's facade scarred with fragments from the bomb's casing. The perpetrators were never identified, though the bombing was believed to be the work of anarchists targeting the symbol of American capitalism. The Morgan firm refused to repair the scars on the building's exterior. The pockmarks from the bomb fragments remained visible, a reminder of the attack but also a statement of resilience. We were attacked, we survived, we continue. For decades, until the building was finally demolished in the late 20th century, those scars were visible, a physical manifestation of the tensions between concentrated financial power and those who opposed it. Through the 1920s and into the early 1930s, the Morgan firm navigated the boom and subsequent crash that replayed in many ways the patterns of the 1890s: speculation, overvaluation, eventual panic and collapse. The stock market crash of 1929 and the Great Depression that followed created a crisis even more severe than the panic of 1907. But this time, the response was different. Instead of a private banker organizing private resources, the federal government intervened directly, with President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal creating programs and agencies that dwarfed anything private finance could have organized. The Depression also led to fundamental reforms of the banking system, reforms that would have been unthinkable in Pierpont Morgan's lifetime. In 1933, Congress passed the Glass-Steagall Act, named for Senator Carter Glass and Representative Henry Steagall. The Act's most significant provision was the forced separation of commercial banking and investment banking. Banks could no longer both accept deposits from ordinary customers and engage in securities underwriting and trading. They had to choose one business or the other. This directly affected J.P. Morgan and Company, which had always done both, accepting deposits, making loans, and also underwriting securities and organizing syndicates for major corporate transactions. The firm now had to decide, would it be a commercial bank or an investment bank? After much deliberation, the Morgan partners chose to remain a commercial bank, accepting deposits and making loans but giving up the securities business. But they also created a new firm, Morgan Stanley, which would be the investment bank, handling securities, underwriting, and other investment banking activities. The separation meant that the integrated approach Pierpont Morgan had pioneered, where a bank could see all aspects of a company's financial needs and provide comprehensive services, was no longer legal. The logic behind Glass-Steagall was that mixing deposit banking with securities trading created conflicts of interest and excessive risk. Banks holding ordinary people's deposits shouldn't be gambling with that money in securities markets. The separation would make the system safer, more stable, less prone to the kind of catastrophic failures that had characterized the Great Depression. Whether Glass-Steagall actually made the system safer is debated even today. The Act was eventually repealed in 1999, and some economists believe that repeal contributed to the financial crisis of 2008. But in the 1930s, the separation seemed necessary, seemed like a clear lesson from the Depression's horrors, and it marked another step away from the personal, integrated banking that Pierpont Morgan had embodied, toward institutional, specialized, regulated banking that characterized most of the 20th century. Through all these transformations, the Pierpont Morgan Library remained as perhaps Morgan's most visible legacy. In 1924, Jack Morgan had donated the library to the public, creating a trust that would maintain it as an institution for scholarly research and public education. The building at Madison Avenue and 36th Street, with its pink Tennessee marble and its extraordinary collections of manuscripts and rare books and art, became a museum and research library that anyone could visit. Walking through the Morgan Library today, or any time since it was open to the public, you can see what mattered most to Pierpont Morgan beyond business and money. The West Room where he conducted the rescue operations during the Panic of 1907 is preserved, with his desk and the card table where he played solitaire, surrounded by the books and art he loved. The East Room, where he kept his most precious manuscripts, still holds Gutenberg Bibles and medieval illuminated texts and letters from George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. The collection speaks to Morgan's aesthetic sensibility, his love of beauty and craftsmanship, his desire to preserve the achievements of human civilization. The art collection that Morgan had accumulated, the paintings and sculptures and decorative arts beyond what could fit in the library, was mostly dispersed after his death, as we mentioned. Much of it went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, which benefited enormously from Morgan's collecting. Some pieces were sold, some given to other museums, some retained by family. But wherever these objects ended up, they carried Morgan's legacy as someone who understood that wealth's highest purpose wasn't mere accumulation, but the acquisition and preservation of beauty. Morgan's influence on American business structure remained visible for decades. The consolidation he pioneered, bringing together competing companies to create more efficient, better organized enterprises, became standard practice in American capitalism. The steel industry, the railroad industry, and many others bore the imprint of Morgan's organizational approach. Whether this consolidation was beneficial or harmful is, like so much about Morgan, a matter of perspective. It created efficiency and stability, but it also reduced competition and concentrated power. The concept of too big to fail, which became such a crucial issue during the financial crisis of 2008, was visible in Morgan's actions during the panic of 1907. He had made decisions about which institutions were too important to fail, which had to be saved despite their problems, because their collapse would trigger wider disaster. This was a reasonable approach during an emergency, but it created moral hazard, the expectation that large important institutions would always be rescued, which could encourage excessive risk-taking. The financial system of the 21st century still grapples with this problem that Morgan's actions in 1907 exemplified. Modern J.P. Morgan Chase, one of the largest banks in the world today, carries Morgan's name and traces its lineage back to his firm, but it's far removed from the personal banking he practiced. J.P. Morgan Chase is a vast institution with hundreds of thousands of employees, trillions of dollars in assets, operations spanning the globe, subject to extensive regulation and oversight. It makes decisions through committees and processes and risk management systems, not through one man's judgment of character and intuition about situations. This is probably necessary given the scale and complexity of modern finance, but something essential was lost. The accountability that came from personal decision-making, the clarity of having identifiable individuals responsible for outcomes. Morgan's fundamental approach to banking, his belief that character mattered more than collateral, that trust was the foundation of credit, that a banker's most important skill was judging people, became obsolete as banking became more systematic and rule-based. Modern credit decisions are made by algorithms that analyze credit scores and financial statements, not by bankers looking borrowers in the eye and deciding whether they can be trusted. This is more fair, less subject to prejudice and favoritism, more consistent, but it's also more mechanical, less able to account for circumstances that don't fit the formula, less human. So how do we assess Pierpont Morgan's legacy? Was he a saviour of capitalism or a monopolist who concentrated too much power in too few hands? Was he a genius of organisation or a robber baron who extracted wealth without creating value? The answer, unsatisfying as it might be, is that he was all of these things, or perhaps that he was neither, that he was simply a man who lived in a particular time when certain things were possible that wouldn't be possible before or after. And he did what he did with the capabilities and within the constraints of that moment. He saved the financial system in 1907, and that was genuinely heroic. He didn't have to do it. He risked his own reputation and resources. And without his intervention, the collapse would have been catastrophic. But he also used his power to build personal wealth and corporate empires that served his interests while claiming to serve the public good. He consolidated industries in ways that created efficiency, but also reduced competition. He wielded enormous power without democratic accountability, making decisions that affected millions of people based solely on his own judgment. Perhaps what's most important to understand about Morgan is that he was a transitional figure, standing between the personal capitalism of the 19th century and the institutional capitalism of the 20th. He embodied the virtues of the old system: personal accountability, decisive leadership, the ability to act quickly in crises, but he also revealed its flaws: concentrated power, lack of democratic oversight, dependence on individuals rather than institutions. His career demonstrated both what was possible through personal authority and why personal authority wasn't sufficient for a modern democratic society. And ultimately, what Morgan himself cared most about wasn't the power or even the money, though he enjoyed both. What he cared about was beauty. He spent his fortune on art, on manuscripts, on objects created by the most skilled craftspeople and artists across centuries of human civilization. He surrounded himself with beauty, immersed himself in it, preserved it for future generations. Banking was what he did, what he was extraordinarily good at, what gave him the resources to pursue his true passion. But the passion itself was for beauty, for the artistic achievements that represented humanity at its best. There's something poignant about this. The most powerful banker in America, the man who could make or break companies with a word, who held the financial system together through force of will, spending his evenings in his library surrounded by medieval manuscripts, studying illuminations created by anonymous monks centuries before, appreciating the patience and skill and faith that had produced such beauty. In those moments, Morgan wasn't a banker or a monopolist or a power broker. He was simply a man who loved beautiful things, who understood that civilization's highest achievements weren't measured in dollars or power, but in art and craft and the human capacity to create meaning and beauty from raw materials. Let that image settle. Morgan in his library late at night after the business of the day was done, holding a medieval manuscript, examining the gold leaf and brilliant pigments applied by hand centuries before, feeling connected across time to the person who had created this beauty, finding in that connection something that all his power and wealth could never quite provide. This was who Pierpont Morgan really was, beneath the gruff exterior and the intimidating presence and the enormous authority. A man who loved beautiful things. A man who understood, perhaps better than he could articulate, that life's meaning resided not in accumulation or power, but in appreciation of what humans could create when they worked at the highest levels of their capabilities. And so we return to the image we began with, the image that perhaps captures Pierpont Morgan better than any other detail of his long and consequential life. His desk at 23 Wall Street, always empty, completely clear, no papers, no files. No clutter of any kind except perhaps a single document he was considering at that moment. The empty desk wasn't just a personal habit or an idiosyncrasy. It was a statement about how power operates, about focus and clarity, about the ability to see what matters without being distracted by what doesn't. Think about what that empty desk represented. In an age when most businessmen's desks were piled high with correspondence and contracts and reports, when the volume of paperwork seemed to prove how important and busy someone was, Morgan's empty desk announced something different. It said, "I don't need to prove my importance through visible busyness. I make decisions, then clear the desk for the next decision. I focus completely on one matter at a time, give it my full attention, resolve it, and move forward." The emptiness was discipline, was clarity, was a kind of Zen approach to power. But the empty desk also reveals something about the nature of authority in Morgan's era. He could keep his desk empty because he had partners and assistants who handled details, because he operated at a level where his role was judgment rather than execution, because the financial system of the early 20th century was small enough and concentrated enough that one man sitting at an empty desk could genuinely understand and influence major segments of it. That kind of authority, that kind of simplified power structure, couldn't exist in the modern world of complex regulations and vast institutions and democratized finance. Morgan's world was slower than ours, more personal, based on relationships that developed over years or decades rather than transactions that happened in milliseconds. When he made a decision to support a railroad or decline to underwrite a stock offering, that decision was communicated by letter or telegram. Not by instant electronic transfer. The pace of business matched human time rather than computer time, and this slower pace allowed for the kind of personal judgment that Morgan specialized in, looking someone in the eye, assessing their character, deciding whether they could be trusted. We've lost that world, probably inevitably, probably necessarily. Modern finance requires speed and scale that personal relationships can't provide. Credit decisions need to be made thousands of times per day, instantly, consistently, based on objective criteria that can be defended and audited. There's no time for a banker to look borrowers in the eye and judge their character. There's no way to scale that approach to a nation of 330 million people and a global economy measured in trillions of dollars. The institutional, algorithmic, regulated banking we have now is probably the only kind that can function at the required scale. But something was lost in the transition. Personal accountability, for one thing. When Pierpont Morgan made a decision, everyone knew who had made it and who bore responsibility for outcomes. When a modern bank makes a decision, it emerges from a process involving multiple people and systems and committees, and often no individual can be held accountable when things go wrong. The diffusion of responsibility that comes with institutional decision-making creates efficiency, but also permits failures without consequences. Trust, too, has changed fundamentally. Morgan believed that trust, personal trust based on character judgment, was the foundation of banking. A man he trusted could borrow without collateral. A man he didn't trust couldn't borrow regardless of collateral. This seems quaint now, seems like it must have been a mask for prejudice and favoritism, a way for people of Morgan's class to exclude those they deemed beneath them. And there was probably truth in that criticism. Morgan's judgments of character were inevitably influenced by his class background, his social milieu, his assumptions about who could be trusted. Yet there was also something real in what he believed. Character does matter. The willingness to honour obligations, to keep promises, to deal honestly even when dishonesty might be profitable. These qualities determine whether lending relationships work. Modern banking tries to capture character through credit scores and payment histories, translating personal qualities into numbers that can be processed systematically. This works reasonably well most of the time, but it's not quite the same as Morgan's approach of looking someone in the eye and deciding whether to trust them. The question of whether Morgan's quote, "A man I do not trust could not get money from me on all the bonds in Christendom," remains relevant is complex. On one level, it's obsolete. Banking can't and shouldn't operate on personal trust alone. On another level, it's eternal. Every financial transaction ultimately depends on trust. Trust that borrowers will repay, that contracts will be honoured, that systems will function as promised. Morgan understood that this trust was fundamental, more fundamental than collateral or legal agreements. He was wrong to think trust could remain personal and subjective in a modern economy, but he was right that trust underlies everything. Consider the irony of Morgan's legacy. He saved capitalism in 1907 through personal intervention, demonstrating both the possibilities and the dangers of concentrated financial power. His success in preventing collapse proved that one man with sufficient resources and authority could stabilize the system. But that very success demonstrated why such concentration of power couldn't be permitted to continue. If the financial system depended on Morgan's willingness and ability to intervene, what would happen when Morgan was gone? What if the next crisis came when there was no Morgan, or when the person with Morgan's power was less capable or less public-spirited? So Morgan's career, his triumph in 1907, led directly to the reforms that would prevent future Morgans from existing. The Federal Reserve, created because of lessons learned from the panic, institutionalized the lender of last resort function that Morgan had performed personally. Glass-Steagall and other banking regulations enacted after the Depression restricted the kinds of power Morgan had wielded. These reforms were necessary, were probably beneficial overall, but they also meant that the kind of decisive personal leadership Morgan had provided during crises couldn't happen again. We gained stability and fairness. We lost the capacity for individual heroism in financial matters. Morgan himself, as a person, rather than as an institutional symbol, remains somewhat mysterious despite all we know about him. He was gruff, intimidating, uncomfortable with small talk or social pleasantries. His disfigured nose made him self-conscious and contributed to his forbidding manner. He rarely explained his decisions, rarely felt the need to justify himself, operated with an assumption of authority that others generally accepted. Yet he was also deeply sentimental, particularly about beauty and art, capable of being moved to tears by a beautiful painting or a perfectly illuminated manuscript. This combination, the harsh exterior and the sensitive soul, defined him. He had to be tough to survive and dominate in the competitive, often ruthless world of 19th century finance. But the toughness was, perhaps, protective colouring for someone who felt things deeply, who was vulnerable to beauty, who found in art and music and craftsmanship a kind of transcendence that banking could never provide. Banking was his work, his arena for exercising power and capability. But art was his passion, his connection to something beyond commerce and competition. The yacht, the Corsair in its various iterations, represented this duality. On one level, it was a tool for conducting business, a floating office where deals were negotiated away from the formality of Wall Street. On another level, it was an escape, a place where Morgan could sail away from the pressures of finance, where he could simply experience the pleasure of being on water, of watching the coast slide past, of feeling wind and sun and the rocking motion of waves. The yacht was both work and play, both tool and sanctuary, reflecting Morgan's own complexity. His library, that beautiful building he constructed next to his Madison Avenue home, served similar dual purposes. It was functional, a place to store and organize the books and manuscripts he was accumulating. But it was also a temple, a sacred space devoted to beauty and learning, a physical manifestation of his belief that civilization's highest achievements deserved to be preserved and honored. That the library later became the command center during the Panic of 1907, that the most important financial decisions of that crisis were made in rooms filled with medieval manuscripts and Renaissance paintings, seems almost poetic. The commercial and the aesthetic, the practical and the beautiful, merged in that space just as they merged in Morgan's character. What would Morgan think of the modern world, of the financial system that emerged from the reforms his career inspired? He would probably find it incomprehensible in its complexity, frustrating in its regulations, disturbing in its speed. The personal relationships that he valued have been replaced by algorithms. The judgment calls that defined his banking have been replaced by formulas and procedures. The concentration of decision-making that allowed him to act decisively has been replaced by diffusion of authority across institutions and regulations. He would recognize that the modern system is probably more stable, more fair, more suited to a democratic society. But he would also see what was lost, the capacity for quick action, the accountability that comes from personal responsibility, the human element in financial relationships. And yet, the core insights Morgan embodied remain relevant. Trust still matters, character still matters, even if we measure it differently now. The need for leadership during crises still exists. Even if that leadership now comes from institutions like the Federal Reserve rather than individuals like Morgan. The tension between stability and innovation, between regulation and freedom, between collective security and individual initiative, these tensions that Morgan's career illuminated remain unresolved, remain central to debates about how financial systems should operate. The empty desk, that symbol we keep returning to, represents something beyond Morgan personally. It represents an approach to power, focused, disciplined, uncluttered by unnecessary complications. It represents a time when authority could be more direct, when one person's judgment could shape major outcomes, when the answer to _10_ was clear and simple. That time is gone, probably irrevocably. The modern world is too complex for empty desk simplicity. But there's something appealing about the image nonetheless, something that speaks to a desire for clarity and focus that remains relevant even in our cluttered, complicated age. Imagine Morgan now, if you can, in his library late at night after everyone else has left. The house next door is quiet. The city outside is as quiet as New York ever gets. He sits at his desk, empty, as always. Or perhaps he's in one of the comfortable chairs, holding a medieval manuscript, examining the illuminations by lamplight. The gold leaf catches the light, glowing with the same brilliance it had when first applied 600 years earlier. The colours, the brilliant blues and reds and greens, remain vivid, testament to the skill of artists who created beauty knowing it might last centuries. In this moment, Morgan isn't the most powerful banker in America. He isn't the man who saved the financial system or created the billion-dollar corporation. He's simply a person appreciating beauty, feeling grateful that such things exist, that humans can create objects of such refinement and grace, that he has the privilege of holding this manuscript, of being a temporary custodian of beauty before passing it on to future generations. This is what he valued most, what he spent his fortune acquiring, what gave his life meaning beyond the accumulation of power. The desk remains empty, waiting, not for papers or projects or problems to solve, but simply present, ready, embodying the possibility of focused attention, of clear decision-making, of authority exercised with discipline and purpose. The emptiness isn't absence, but potential, not void, but space for what matters. And what mattered to Morgan ultimately was beauty, the beauty of a perfectly organised enterprise, yes, but more deeply the beauty of art and craft and human achievement at its highest levels. Let that image rest with you now, the empty desk in the quiet library, surrounded by centuries of human artistic achievement, the yacht at anchor in calm water, rocking gently with the tide, the office at 23 Wall Street, its facade still scarred from the bombing but its essential purpose unchanged, a place where decisions are made, where power is exercised, where the work of finance continues, and Morgan himself, long gone now, more than a century dead, but somehow still present in the institutions he shaped, the reforms his career inspired, the beauty he preserved, the questions his life raises about power and responsibility, and the proper organisation of financial systems. His story is over, but the questions it raises remain. How much power should individuals hold? How do we balance efficiency with fairness? What's the proper role of personal judgment versus institutional rules? How do we maintain accountability in complex systems? These questions don't have simple answers, and Morgan's life doesn't provide a simple template. But his story illuminates the questions, makes them concrete, shows us what's at stake in how we choose to organise economic power. The empty desk waits in memory, clear and ready, a symbol of an era that's past but also of timeless principles, focus, clarity, discipline, the capacity to give full attention to what matters most. Morgan is gone. His world is gone. But something of what he represented, something of his understanding that character and trust and beauty matter, that life is more than transactions and calculations, that civilization depends on preserving its highest achievements, this remains. Waiting like that empty desk, ready for us to recognise and honour and carry forward into whatever future we're building. And so we've walked together through the life of J.P. Morgan, from his childhood in Hartford through the building of empires to that quiet end in Rome. We've been on this journey for hours now, moving slowly through the Gilded Age, through financial panics and billion-dollar deals, through the accumulation of power and the appreciation of beauty. If you've enjoyed this calm exploration of history's most powerful banker, a like and subscribe truly helps others find these peaceful ways to end their day. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being part of this community of thoughtful listeners. Wherever you are right now, whatever corner of the world you're resting in, I hope you found something valuable here tonight. I hope your breathing has slowed, that the weight of your own day feels lighter. Morgan's story reminds us that power is temporary, that beauty endures, that what we value matters more than what we accumulate. If you're lying down, let yourself sink deeper into your mattress. Take a slow breath, in through your nose, out through your mouth. The empty desk remains empty, waiting for nothing, complete in its stillness. You need remember nothing. You need do nothing. Just rest. Sleep well, wherever you are. May your dreams be gentle. May you wake refreshed. The stories are told. The desk is empty. Good night.